Welcome here on the panel discussion on paradigms of economics in the contextual world. So we have our panelist, Bhanumurthy from Director Madras School of Economics, Chennai, and Vice-Chancellor Dr. Ambedkar School of Economics, Bangalore. Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay, who is Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay, Professor at Indian Institute of Technology, Indian Institute of Statistical Institute, ISI, New Delhi. Sorry for that. Professor Mausumi Das, Professor Shiv, Nadar University, New Delhi. So welcome here, everyone. Professor Haripriya Gundimeda will be the moderator in the session. We'll proceed with her.
May I request all the panelists to be on the stage? So we are having very illustrious panel here. Though she introduced very briefly, but most of them are very, very distinguished scholars in this particular field. Now the session is very interesting. It's paradigms of economics. As you know, if you look at, so economics has got this honor of being called as economic sciences, and we get the Nobel because of that, right? But the science, if you look at the scientific community, it's basically you have a certain path, and then there is you disprove that, and so you have a new shift. Now, but in economics, the thing is there is no such set thought, there is no set process, it's all very random. We are just drawing our inferences based on the observations, right? We tend to. So, but then, whenever there is in scientific community, whenever you find something, falsification basically leads to a paradigm shift. In economics, the paradigm shift happens in multiple ways. Either we set the instruments for policy. If some certain thing doesn't work, then we try to change it. Or we have a new school of thought. Or the third one is much more radical, which is the change in the policy. Or even the entire policy changes, or maybe the framework changes, the thought process changes. That's where we are. And I would like the panelists to give their views on this, what kind of paradigm shift, maybe what kind of thought processes would change in the coming decades in their, based on their perspective, disciplinary experience. So you can take around 7 minutes to make a statement. Then after that, probably we'll follow from what you said and we'll draw inferences, or maybe I'll ask you some questions based on your expertise, and you can actually answer this. Maybe can I ask who would like to start now? Okay, maybe you have PPT, probably can start. Yeah, yeah, he's well prepared.
So first, most people are talking about the effect on the labor market as far as artificial intelligence is concerned. And many years ago, unfortunately in my formative years, I spent a couple of years in the World Bank, and I'm sort of used to this 2x2 kind of boxes. So, and so that's broadly what happens to labor in each of these 4 boxes, is one question. But there's also the now management usually doesn't like labor. And in addition to wage costs, there are quote-unquote management costs. The fact that you want to actually have to control them, they're disruptive, they're agentic, they do things by themselves, problematic things, right? So fewer you have them, the better. And what AI enables you to do, and as Abhiroop and I were talking yesterday, is basically reduce the cost of doing away with people. Which means not only do I save wages, I get the psychic satisfaction of not having to deal with an unruly bunch of people who come from different backgrounds from me and generally take decisions that I need to mitigate, right? So that's a second kind of structure. But my fundamental thing about AI is, what does it do to the nature of innovation? Currently, what you're talking about is a lot of people seem to think it will do very well because it can read radiographic images and sort of detect stuff that humans are not being able to detect, find patterns that others are not able to find. But fundamentally, if you look at that story, you need to see that they are quote unquote incremental because they're extrapolating from a given data set, a large data set. So the question then is innovation then doomed to be incremental in an AI world? Could you invent the motor car in a horse-drawn economy if the horse-drawn economy was an AI economy? Right? So that's one of the questions on the innovation side, and that's one area in which I think people aren't thinking as much as they're thinking about the labor side. What does this do to the nature of innovation? Right? Let me then quickly turn to climate change, and there the issue is, which you had a wonderful lecture yesterday by Shailja, and so you have the mitigation story is well understood. And there are reductions in consumption, essentially a shift in the kinds of consumption you want to do, especially if they're high carbon kinds of consumption, the nature of investment that happens. But once you move to adaptation, you realize that the investment you make in adaptation is largely insurance. You're protecting yourself against a flood that might happen. You're protecting yourself against heat that might sort of create something else, right? Like with the nature of most such investments, the actual event may or may not occur. So if a larger proportion of your capital investment is moving towards insurance rather than actually building productive units that then generate other kinds of output, what does that mean for growth? So both on the innovation side, coming from an II, from the nature of investment side, coming from climate change, how is the relationship between capital and growth, between investment and growth, how does that go? That's one thing that you want to put together, right? The second thing, if we're looking at fiscal policy and monetary policy, right? And now, fiscal policy is an odd thing, as you're now realizing in places like the US and Scandinavia and so on and so forth. The core story around fiscal policy is an optimal tax rates is fundamentally at which point in time do people actually, does it affect people's work incentives? 10%, 20%, 30%, at which point in time does effort actually push back? And one of the things that is possibly true is that the level, that differs according to some notion of fairness. Right? People will cut back if they think they're getting an unfair deal. But the notion of fairness is something that is socialized. What you think is fair is what comes from the context that there's no absolute notion of fairness. So especially as you move into this world and moving towards basic income structures, the kind of thing that people talk about on AI and labor side, and the nature of taxation needs to therefore move, what does it do to this notion of what's a fair tax story? And how are those parameters sort of contextualized? It's a second kind of story to look through. On the monetary policy side, of course, and this has been already a bunch of work that's happening on this now, on effects of digital currencies and monetary transmission mechanisms that sort of comes through. And finally, the notion of public goods. And the notion of public goods becomes important in two contexts. I'll come back to it later when I discuss a little bit of government. But fundamentally, the way in which health and education are treated around the world, are they public or not public, then becomes an important part of the story. And we'll sort of talk a little bit about why that stuff is public in the next section, which is once you talk to the firms and consumers, one of the things that you're seeing with things like the Zomatos, with things like work from home, with things like structures, is what I call a deorganization of the firm, right? The standard firm structure of managers, employment, location, all of that stuff is now getting picked apart. Right? And you essentially now, and the gig economy is the one which brings that stuff to the fore. You see this entire tension in the Uber cases, both in India, in the US. Is an Uber driver an employee, or is that Uber driver an entrepreneur, a contractor, right? And in that sense, it's pretty formal, right? Lots of extents of the formality story are, and yet in some sense, it has lots of characteristics of the informal that we are familiar with. But one of the key issues once you move into that space, especially in countries where social security and employment are linked, is what does that do to the notion of social security? And that's where the notion of public goods structure, social security sort of comes in. As you move the structure of the firm and the organization, what implications does it have for that part of the story? That's another kind of structure. We've also been hearing about Trump and tariffs. Now, what you do know is nowadays you can print stuff, right? I can basically have a printer somewhere close to you, and you want a particular goods customized. The stuff is asked to print, and then it gets delivered to your house. Now, that instruction to print might come from another country. So, to what extent is that export? Should it be subject to tariffs? What part of it should be subject to tariffs? Right? Because you are no longer transporting goods. The whole process of transportation has now become essentially not transporting the physical good, but essentially transporting instructions for making that good to a printer near you. Right? How does that sort of change the nature of trade and transport and a variety of other things? And finally, when you're looking at the structures, there's a structure of consumption. You're all used to consuming goods. You're also used to consuming services. In most part, you think nowadays of services is being provided by another human. But going forward, that service may be consumed, and it may not be another human providing that service. Right? If you're essentially in a virtual reality world, you're consuming a particular experience, but there is not interacting with, so the labor intensity of services that you're sort of used to, that again also sort of goes away, right? So the nature of consumption, if that shifts, what does that do both to the extent of how you end up taxation, structures, varieties of structures that sort of comes to it. That's another kind of structure. Finally, looking at the role of space, that's stuff that I do some stuff on from time to time. And the core issue on space and cities is basically innovation happens through serendipity. Serendipity is enhanced by proximity, and hence urban is important because that's where all of you guys are together, you go out, have a coffee, you exchange an idea, and that's how innovation happens. Now, if all of this was entirely virtual, if all of you guys are sitting somewhere else, that serendipitous interaction doesn't happen. So what does that do to the nature of innovation? What does that do to the role of cities per se? Right? So that's one of the questions that one needs to start thinking about. Because remember, the broad theme that I'm looking at is fundamentally, if you're looking at growth and change, how are these various things driving the innovation story going forward, right? And then in this kind of thing, where all these things are changing, how is this transition mediated? And that's, I think Shelja yesterday spoke a lot about the wicked problems, and a lot of it is essentially about mediating these kinds of transactions. And the core issue is the impatience with deliberation at the time of these transactions. And you see that in the results of the US election. Right? And it's also theoretically hard to sort of aggregate preferences. Right? So how exactly is that kind of stuff to happen? One of the things I just put that in because in understanding the role of government, one of our things is about government is about plumbing. This is the Banerjee Duflo kind of formulation. And one way of doing the role of government is just should be doing a lot more RCTs to figure out what government can do and not do. And I'd be happy to I don't think that that is a good idea because of two reasons now. One, I think I always thought it wasn't particularly effective because of external validity. And now with the kind of disruption that's happening, it's again harder to make that particular case, but that's something that we can put in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think after a very structured, very structured presentation by Partha, I don't know how much I will add. Let me thank IIT, and this is my first visit after you became Department of Economics. I think that's one paradigm shift that we are seeing now. And I think it's going to be very, very important paradigm shift for economic research in this country. So congratulations to the department and IIT for as I think we were just discussing before we came here, a lot of action has to happen from IITs. So all the future paradigm shift has to happen from, I think, from IIT. I think, in fact, even Partha also mentioned some places about innovation. I think all those things have to come from these places. So all the best for the department. Well, I think in terms of the future paradigm shift, there's so much discussion about 2047, so I'm not going to talk about it. There's a lot of funding also goes to 2047, so I'm sure there is a funding-based research that is happening, and so I don't want to deal with that much. Broadly speaking, what Partha has suggested, I think all these issues are there in two reports. One is by Maria Draghi report, if you look at in December or November, where the Draghi report speaks about the future of Euro, and he's almost like he's crying in that report. You look at that report, and it looks like he's crying when he's writing the report, saying how the Euro actually lost in this whole global economic growth thing. The second report that I would request all of you to look at is the economic survey, the recent economic survey. Clearly, there is so much is written in that, and I'm sure there are a lot more topics can come from there for the next 10 years or 15 years or so. So if you look at both the reports, very clearly it mentions that there is a geo-economic fragmentation. When you want to look at the world right now and also reflect on how it will be impacting our the way economy works, you need to reflect these changes in your simple Keynesian identity. That is, y equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. So in that last 30, 40 years, one major driver that really drove this whole world, particularly the emerging market economies, is the external engine, right? I think the external engine is one thing that really driven all of us, for the past 30 years. Now I think the external engine, I think, seems to be getting shut in the whole process. What is left is only two engines, that is consumption and the investment. So in this environment, to what extent our macro theories really help us to understand how we are going to perform in the coming years is definitely a big challenge for all of us. Added to that, we are seeing, almost every day, one pen is thrown on the audience that Trump signs an order and said, just throw the pen. And it's almost to say that, it's like a war with the pen. We keep hearing that pen is mightier than sword or something like that. So what we see right now is Trump is almost throwing pens every day. And again, that's really a big challenge for open economy macroeconomics. And I can give you many examples how it actually questions the kind of thinking that we have in the open economy macroeconomics. One example is that when you see that the US interest rates came down, the textbook says that, you should have flight of capital from the United States. But what we have seen is the reverse of that. The capital went back to the United States. So that doesn't really been taught us in the macro books. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing right now in the new environment, and I think researchers have to really focus more on how we can contextualize our macro theories that we are studying in the textbooks. In fact, many of the times I keep talking about a couple of issues in Indian macroeconomics. At the end, I put a slide where it says theoretical macroeconomics is different from empirical macroeconomics. Okay, Indian macroeconomics is different from textbook macroeconomics. So what I'm trying to tell you is that whatever that we read in your in the textbooks, I think it is very important to be empirically examined so that it will be useful for domestic public policy. And there's one institution in the country which does such research is the Reserve Bank of India. I think we need to look at what the Reserve Bank of India are doing every day, and I think that would be a much bigger lesson for many youngsters, those who are here, and they're doing very silently, so that is more important. So I urge all of you, the youngsters who are here, to look at RBI website very regularly and try to adapt what is there in that report. Coming back to Draghi report, there are 3 Ds he talks about, which again is relevant for how we navigate our economies from here onwards. Digitalization, decarbonization, and defense. I think these are the 3 Ds that he talks about, and Partha already hinted on that decarbonization issue, but I'm not going to get into that. But I would like to add 2 more Ds for that. One is that data for Indian context. The other one is what economics theory talks about is deregulation. So the 5 Ds are really very important going forward. Now that I work a little more on statistics and econometrics, I thought let me spend a little more time on how going forward we need to really reflect on this applied econometrics. Of course, all of you know there's so much of discussion, debate about Indian data and Indian statistics. But I think if you look at last almost 2 years, again maybe Abhiroop can focus a little more on that, there is so much change in the way we actually collect the data, how we project the data. I'm not talking on the GDP numbers, but if you look at, there are many other surveys, the long-term, the survey that India is adopting. I think there is certainly a very different, very paradigm shift in my view in the way Indian statistics is going to be collected, and going forward, I think this is again a big challenge for the researchers. We have much high frequency data than what we used to do in the past. Now PLNFS survey, you get every 3 months or maybe a little more higher frequency, I don't know, but we do have more data that is coming up. But I think one challenge that we all might face is the comparability with the past data. I think young researchers, those who are here, don't get into these old debates. I think we need to leave that and we have to go forward, particularly when we have new data sets and new methodologies. Don't ever try to compare with the past data and past methodology. I think we'll end up we get stuck in those controversy, we'll not be able to go forward. In terms of time series econometrics, my own experience is that, most of the relationships are time varying. Okay, you don't get struck with the studies that is being estimated some 10 years back or 20 years back. And I think what is important is that we need to recalibrate, re-estimate all those parameters going forward. Otherwise, ultimately, your research should get into public policy. Otherwise you just, publish in A-star journal, get in job in IIT Bombay. That is not sufficient. But what is important is, you need to see that this policy research, I think policy research is the need of the hour in the country. don't worry about, in fact, Prof. Haripriya also pointed out, don't worry about the results. Sometimes you don't get what kind of results you want from the textbook, but I think if you're getting different from the textbook is much more challenging. You need to defend that results, and I think that takes all your effort to, prove that what you are estimated is, useful for public policy. That's what my own experience. Your profession will reject you in the beginning, but I think after 2-3 years, they will only come back to you and say what you have done 2-3 years back is more relevant than what. My one classic example is the multipliers that we have done some time back. It was the 2012 paper which rescued Indian economy for some time. I think it's been used very extensively in the public policy in the post-COVID. Here I thought, today morning I was looking at one LinkedIn post where IMF is estimating job multiplier. I think we have estimated output multipliers, but I think what is required after we listening to Partha, I think what is required is we need to look at how we can improve the jobs, and for that we need to look at what sectors will really help in improving the jobs. And I think job multiplier study would be very useful. And this slide is saying for the emerging market economies, job multiplier is higher in the sector, water and sanitation sector, and also in the road sector. But when it comes to advanced countries, it says that job multiplier is higher in the energy sector. So I think this distinction is very important for public policy, and especially when we are focusing more on jobs and growth. So I think we need to focus more on what sectors can generate more jobs and what sectors can generate more output. On the AI, there's one report in October, I don't know, Partha, whether you have seen, there's a report from ILO, which the worst case scenario that projects for the world in the context of artificial intelligence is that artificial intelligence will produce output and resources human beings have to only consume. So they talk about universal basic income as a alternative for artificial intelligence, or maybe that is the one way it can complement, but that is not the way that we need to look at, and we need to really look at how the artificial intelligence will help in improving what we call total factor productivity going forward. Draghi report talks about improving total factor productivity by 2 percentage points, which needs a very high investments. And I think all this have some implications on India going forward, especially when we want to aspire to become Vikasit Bharat by 2047. So there are other things. Let me stop here. Maybe one can come back. One small point. I think in our textbooks we keep reading. We have been reading, whoever read this, Dattan Sundaram and all those things. We keep reading that population is a problem. High population is a major problem for Indian economy. But I think right now, what we are seeing is completely reversal. Now there is a crisis in the world that there is a decline in the population growth, and especially if you look at the European Union and United States and other countries, they're actually struggling with a declining population. So there is another change in the whole macro that high population no more a riskier kind of a context, right? We are talking about, we need more population in the world. So that is another change that we are seeing, especially in the context of when you are having restrictions on labor mobility. How we are going to address this population issue is going to be a big challenge for the international macroeconomics. Let me stop here.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I didn't realize. Yeah, so I agree with Bhanu. This is my first visit to IIT Mumbai, and so it's a paradigm shift for me as well. Yeah, so I'm, in my sort of, short speech, I'm going to focus on something very different than what Partha and Bhanu talked about, and it's sort of, my perspective comes from my own research area, which is growth and macro development. And the kind of paradigm shift that I'm seeing in the recent, years, in last 10, 15 years, is a very sort of, different way of looking at growth. And to be more precise, what I'm seeing more and more is that sociological factors, such as, culture, such as values, sentiments, norms, are taking an increasing space in any discourse on growth. And that to me is very different from the way we used to, in a textbook teaches growth. It's not about technology anymore, or not just about technology anymore. It's not just about factors anymore. It's basically relating economics to other branches of social sciences, particularly sociology. And to my mind, that's very important. And that's very different also in some sense to think about growth. And so much so that I do see a tremendous change in terms of the recent writings on growth, which is sort of mediated through culture. So much so that in David Landes, in his 1999 book on poverty and wealth and the poverty of nation, actually said that if you learn anything from the history of economic development, it is that culture makes all the difference. Now, the question is that, those who are, economists belonging to my generation or even older would probably say that what is so new about that? Didn't the old development economics of 1950s talk about various cultural and social aspects of development? I think in our generation, I don't know about you guys, but our generation did learn, did read Rostow's book on stages of development, where the idea about growth was moving from a traditional society to a modern society, and the modern society was conceptualized as a sort of, Western society with its associated with its values and cultures and so on. So therefore, what is the new about, why am I calling it a paradigm shift? It was always there, probably latent. So I think one reason why I want to call it a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about growth is that, one, the earlier literature sort of, which was talking about culture was not predominantly in economics, because economics, our standard traditional economics preferences are supposed to capture culture, and we hardly want to open up preferences. And secondly, I think cultural impact through which growth happens was mostly, culture was thought about, or modernity was thought about as a Western culture. And I think 1960s, the development of the various, Asian miracle countries gave a jolt to that idea that you don't necessarily need Western values to develop. Growth can happen even in the Eastern economies. And I think because of that, these ideas took a back seat. But the difference with that idea and the modern way of looking at culture, to my mind, is that culture is increasingly becoming identified with identities. So what is happening is that culture is sort of it's becoming more and more individual centric. In other words, the way we think about culture in the modern growth literature, or even in the modern economics literature, is that we are thinking about an individual which has multiple identities coming from various cultures, and therefore what is needed for growth, is sort of interacts with this kind of various kind of cultural identities. And that's a pluralistic approach which is, to my mind, very important. And it is also important because it makes policy making tremendously difficult. I think Shailaja touched upon on some of this aspect yesterday. Because, which cultural identity becomes dominant, it's so context specific that, it's one size fits all kind of policies are going to be very, very difficult. And growth theorists are recognizing that. So having said that, basically the new paradigm shift has individuals at, and the cultural identity of the individual as its, central point, also means that any policy, therefore, has to be mediated through individual action. So the role of individuals then becomes very, very important. And to that extent, the recent literature that has started from from around early 2000 and so on, there's quite a bit of literature in many of the prominent journals now in the last, as I said, 15 years, which are talking about main focus of that topic. Those works are basically pathways through which culture can affect growth. The transmission of cultural traits, which has become, because if you're thinking about this as individual traits, how do they get transmitted across individual in the society or across generations? The interaction between culture and market, again, very important, because that's where sociology and economics will come, come face to face, and there are important works which have, tried to look at this. And the interaction between culture and state, again, that's where, as a public policy person, that's where you want to focus on. Now, the areas which have sort of, which economists have sort of, looked at in this, through this lens of culture, entails, for example, investment choice, savings behavior, fertility choice, labor force participations, particularly female and so on, migration decisions, etc., even to some extent innovation. But that's a new area, new way of thinking, which probably wasn't there. So it's not no longer a technology per se, but what kind of technology which which can sort of be propagated given the cultural values, or if you want to change the cultural values, what are the policies? So to my mind, this is a whole new world of sort of, thinking about economic growth and development. And to my mind, that's exactly where we should probably focus more and more. I mean, already some research are coming up, but I think we need to focus on that. And to some extent, probably behavioral economics do talk to some of these issues, but behavioral economics, to the extent it's sort of, it's not so, should I say, rational way of thinking about things. This way of thinking about culture is very different. You have your culture coming from, as your preferences imbibed in you, and then you make rational choices. So in that context, therefore, culture and rational choices is also, it's not necessarily an impulsive decision. It's just that it's mediated through what you have learned. And I think its time has come to think a little bit about how those preferences are formed, because they have important implication for many of our choices, which will then have important implications going forward for the growth and development of the country. And I sort of, I'll probably come back to many of these if you have questions, but to my mind, the most important implication of this approach is that then it also necessitates the government or the policymakers to think about pluralistic approach. And it kind of resonates exactly with what Shailaja was saying yesterday, that you have to take local culture, local preferences into account. And the second point, very difficult point for us, for policymakers, is that how do we even change preferences? Again, a policy that's going to change preferences is very different from a policy which gives you income incentives. And so therefore the costs are different, the benefits are different, the way you frame the policies are going to be different. So to my mind, these are important challenges, but given the paradigm shift, I think it's a welcome change in terms of paradigm shift, but it also opens up a lot of challenges for us as economists and for the policymakers. So I'll stop here and I can come back to other issues if there is any question.
Yeah, so being the last person on the panel, everything has been covered. But I did notice that everyone is writing something. So I started writing something here. But as it happens that when I start writing on a panel, I cannot read what I've written, because I'm pretty much listening to other people. So anyway, I'll try to see what I wrote, and then maybe I'll just... So let me tell you a story, because I think you've already heard a large kind of ideas from everyone. So I have a friend who's also a researcher. Some of you know him, Nishit Prakash. And I was visiting Patna on some work. And he was basically trying to work with the police, making them do theater to get gender sensitization, okay? To have, to create that. And I was, after a day's work, involving his father, who was also a police officer, trying to help us, or help him. Nishit went inside to kind of gather some things. And his father came to me and said, बेटा ये मेरा बेटा आजकल क्या कर रहा है, हम लोग तो जब पढ़ते थे इकोनॉमिक्स तो हमने पढ़ा था, ये सब चीज़ तो कभी थी नहीं. Gender sensitization, non-cognitive, behavioral, psychology. If you show this to any person who studied economics, typically for entrance exams or through undergraduate, this is like a completely new thing. And he was worried that his, son was basically being led astray in some ways. And, I being slightly senior and based out of Indian Statistical Institute actually knew. So I would tell him, so this story to me actually is a kind of an important story for a lot of us working on kind of new economics. Okay? I work on education, I work on pedagogies. My mother, who's a school teacher, keeps telling me all the time that ये तो लोग क्या कर रहे हो, ये तो हम लोगों ने बैरी जॉन ने बताया था हमें कि ये होता है स्कूल में, हमने 80s में कर चुके हैं. What experiments do you run using pedagogies and stuff, right? So I ask myself, and I think a lot of people now, if you look at journals and so on and so forth, should ask yourselves that, then what is economics? It is true that economics, a lot of economics is about these things. Of course, a lot of economics is also about some of the topics that we have broached earlier. But, in some sense, especially those who are going to work, you will have to publish in the future and talk about important issues. Need to then think about what is this thing that we are bringing, right? If educationists have been working on education, sociologists have been working on culture, psychologists have been working on, behavioral sciences, then what is the economist doing using in that, right? And where is our contribution? And I think one way that I'm slowly kind of reconciling, and this is for you to consider, is not to think about economics as a subject at all, but to think of it as a lens, right? We have, through our years of training, we have kind of looked at problems in my colleague Aruna always says, all of economics is just marginal cost equal to marginal benefit. But it is true, it's a powerful idea. If you go outside economic circles, it's a very hard idea sometimes to explain to other people, right? The idea of optimizing agents or heuristics, in some sense, mimicking optimizing agents, is not a very easy idea always for people to understand. And, an acceptance of things from outside is also very specific to economics. I'm sure it's also true for some other subjects, but especially true, even the advent of mathematics. In economics, this has been going on for many, many years. We have allowed it to the extent that at some point in the 80s, people were saying we do applied mathematics, many economists, right? So I think that there are some strong points of the discipline. And the idea is that now with all these strong points, how do we kind of attack problems that we see around us? These problems are, some of them, kind of the older problems, older variables that we have cared about, the GDPs, the labor supplies, and so on, technology adoption, and so on and so forth. But a lot of these variables are very new, right? Culture, yeah, it's a variable. I'm an empiricist. The first thing for me is to how to even think about measuring through, maybe some barometer survey, maybe something else, maybe qualitative surveys. So it's new variables that define the richness in some sense of the subject. So I don't know whether we will be more, economics will be a more less pessimistic science, but it will be a richer science for sure in the future, because the number of things that we need to, or we can think about, is going to be larger, okay? So for you, it's like going to a kind of a candy store. You can talk about confidence, you can talk about years of education, you can talk about productivity, TFP. There's a larger array of things that you can talk about. But of course, I think one of the things that a lot of us don't do, including students, is that we always think that we are creating these things for the first time. And we are not. And so I think, a bit of training ourselves in particular areas. If you're looking at, health, You should not just look at health economics, you should look at medical sciences. If you're doing environment, you should know environmental sciences. So the requirements of what is required to work in a subject, this will be larger. It will not be, like I was telling someone, Shovik is a real health economist. Because, he's not doing DID with, on the left-hand side, height for weight, or weight for height, or something like that. That to me is a development economics economist who thought ki chalo significant aa ja raha hai, the health variable to laga diya, right? If you're a health economist, you have to be an expert in understanding disease, in epidemiology, you have to understand health-seeking behavior, that may require some psychology, and so on and so forth. And staying away from it, saying that that is not economics, is going to basically put you back in debates about these topics. Okay, so I think that's something that you will have to take into account. That we will need new variables. Some of them will be behavioral. They may not be rational, but they are there for you to look at. Some of them may be non-cognitive, difficult things to measure. Some of them may require marrying qualitative methods with quantitative methods. I think you should be open to all those ideas. And I think that's a big shift in how we need to think about economics. I think in IIT, this is the right kind of forum to talk about such a shift. Then we come to methods. Okay, so of course, leaving aside qualitative methods, which I think is a big missing, piece in economic debates, at least by economists. I think how we look at qualitative studies also has to change, in the sense that qualitative of the nature of having many hours of conversation where you record text, try to read text through machine learning, try to figure out various things that a machine can, for example, figure out if you were to do it at scale, right? Who do you collect this qualitative data from? As a part of the NSSO, I've been having, at least suggesting, without much success, I must say, that, a lot of machine learning, for example, is happening on text. But, one of the great things about random sampling is that it gives an opportunity to everyone to represent their views. It's a random sample, everyone has some more or less equal probability. A lot of these machine learning tools that we are using for many of these qualitative kind of text kind of stuff is convenient sampling. Wherever it's there, we are kind of sampling. So once we take into account qualitative, kind of feel that qualitative views are important, of course, qualitative researchers may be important, but we may not be very good qualitative researchers to begin with, is how do we make this systematic, where we sample randomly qualitative surveys, and then let machines run through them and try to predict something of importance. I'm not saying we are there, but it's definitely in IIT I can say that this is a direction in which, a lot of these things we could use. Causality. How much of a big deal is causality? I don't know. I think economists are very, very wedded to the idea of causality. It's a little kind of strange that I'm saying it because I've made a career out of causality. But I think that it's a time when we realize that if you have sectoral domain knowledge, sometimes that will trump statistical designs which are completely kind of blind to context. I run an RCT in some place, I don't need to know what people do there. Yeah, control treatment, can look at two means, that's okay. I'll find some study that says that this happened in Morocco and El Salvador or something, right? But once you actually move away from that, to make an argument is for people to have a lot of knowledge of context. And I think that is one thing I find increasingly shrinking from people who are working more and more on some of these modern methods, that people are not sector experts anymore. Yeah, they are the IHDS, DID, left-hand side, wait for age kind of people. Okay, that's why they are not able to contribute much to debates. Though I must say, in terms of publications, they are doing better. Indian students then generally are doing much better. I also want to point out that, there is probably a need, and this is not a new paradigm, but I think it will come, for a theory for emerging countries. So one of my grouse, and I'm actually a person who likes macro very much. I started my thesis with macro. One of my grouse against macro, and I get into debates with Mausumi, Moni Shankar, all these people all the time, is I feel that many of these models are kind of validated, what variables they track. There have been debates about these for years and years in developed countries. We have picked many of them and we are running them. Yeah, I mean, they're publishable because they map onto something that people know about abroad. But are these the right models? Why are we not able to extend these in a more realistic way to the kind of markets we have, to the bargaining for wages we have? How much is a competitive wage a great assumption? I'm told that we should follow the Milton Friedman kind of way, that if it works, it works. But I don't know. This is something for many people who are interested in macro to think about, and I think they are, because this is the new kind of thing. Already people are working on it, but I think, I don't know whether it will become mainstream in Western academia. And I don't think we need to think so much. I think for me, 2047 Viksit Bharat is, we have great journals, we don't care what other people think. Okay? So we develop models that are useful for us, and I think that is something that is of need. On micro, there have been, because micro models are very flexible. You can almost model anything. So when it comes to any behavioral thing, humans more or less behave very similarly. But societies are different, economies are different, and I think that you will see. People like Mausumi, Bhanu, they were going to kind of move that, and I encourage you to think a bit like that. Push the margin. Obviously, everything is incremental at your stage, but push the margin a little bit towards that side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very, very interesting points all of you have made. I think you touched all paradigms, from the classical to the Keynesian. Then you talked about the neoliberal, where we opened the world and we thought the competition is the key thing. And then we realized that there are so many inequalities and the Trump tariffs and talking about make US great again and close the border, now the deglobalization scenario. And then we talked, now we are into the neoliberal, and wherein we are new paradigm, right? Basically, we're talking about all the crises like the climate change and the inequalities and other insecurities and the digital revolution that we are facing, right? Now, and all this, along with this, then we also have this AI and the big data. Now, my question to the panel is, now, as Abhiroop has pointed out, basically the crisis failed us, in the sense that the Western economic theories could not predict the crisis, could not predict anything. So it's not the problem of the emerging economies alone. Even their models could not predict their own economies. Now, in what way should the economic discipline emerge? Or should we be rewriting the books, right? And maybe Bhanu can also answer this question of the role of, if you look at the classical, when I teach the HS 101, EC 101 now, we just start with, we are rational and we take a decision in a certain way, like your marginal benefits are equal to marginal costs, and we talk about that. And we also talk about a willingness to pay and the consumer surplus and the producer defining the welfare, wherein we do not know those, like how much is the willingness to pay of commodity, because the consumers are all different. But then the AI has actually revolutionized the whole thing, right? Now, like the airlines know your preference, whether or not so each of us will get actually different fares. Somebody recently pointed out that Uber, if you book on iPhone versus your Android, you get a different fares. Now, how do you think the whole discipline, our research should be oriented so that, we are actually survive this new paradigm? Maybe you can give your disciplinary perspectives on this. Probably Bhanu can start, or Abhiroop. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things I have to say that, economics is a model of the average and what happens usually. Extraordinary events, I do not think that they can do. Having said that, many of these models post the crisis have now started thinking about risks which are very, very low probability, how to think about. So there is this idea that we are Jyotishis and we can say everything about the world, this we should give up. We gave up long time back. It's not possible. It's too heterogeneous. An aggregate is very difficult to talk about. But I think that when it comes to global kind of problems, I think the global, for example, macroeconomics has already taken into account many of the things they thought was missing. For example, a richer modeling of the financial sector is now in many of the macro models that people look. So I think that point is well taken. In terms of, what firms are doing, I think Kaushik has some interesting ideas, Kaushik Basu, about, of these firms being so different, what does it mean? Even in fact, you can even ask, why do you need a firm now? Right? I mean, we had, this was a long-term standing question on why do we have firms and not agents selling basically various parts of the job. And the idea is there's some transaction cost, and that is what gives advantages for agglomeration of people and, of workers, managers. But now with gig economy, everything, I mean, we don't even know, and people are already, looking at those kind of issues. I think that, I don't think it's these kind of this new data. In fact, we can contribute. I know people in Uber who have told me that Uber just looks at what people are willing to pay without realizing that actually that is not the experiment you want to run. Those are all endogenous. If you were to look at observational data on how much people are willing to pay, you would never ever say that that's demand elasticity, right? So, I mean, a lot of economists are working in these companies and they're actually taking tools that we have developed over 20, 30 years to actually be able to solve that. So that's good. I mean, now we have lots more data to test some of those kind of things. But I think the newer things are coming from, I would say, to me, the biggest challenge is that there is a feeling that what we thought as gospel truth in economics is actually very weather dependent. I spent my grad school learning that trade was good and how great advantages of trade are. As soon as Trump came, suddenly I started seeing papers in NBR saying that trade can have bad impacts on people and so on and so forth. So I think the correction you're seeing is actually not requiring a different model. It is just more honesty in terms of what these processes mean, what impacts they have, and giving equal importance. I mean, we all know that once there is trade, there's disruption, and in our footnotes we always say labor will then get retrained, and there'll be unemployment, labor will get retrained, and miraculously come back to more productive jobs. I mean, that is basically Trump, right? They haven't. And so we have, we are now again challenging that, but there's nothing wrong in trade models. And if you look at trade has been developing in a richer and richer way over the last 40, 50 years. So I think that is true for many subjects. Even like, for example, Mausumi's talk about culture, growth. I mean, these are coming in slowly into all very conventional models. So I think that the main challenge is not the data. The main challenge is that there are many issues that we have chosen not to work on because we did not think that, at least people in the global north didn't think it was particularly important. And as we kind of, care now more and more about what is happening here, we want to have better models to describe them, right? So they developed something which worked for the kind of variables they were looking for. We need to develop something for something else that we may care about. I, for example, look at the debate on GDP. I spent a lot of time reading the history of GDP. We studied it in national income accounts. It's a subject that I completely hated, right? It's all about how to value women's labor and whether it's domestic housewife maid ke saath comparison ho sakta hai ki nahi. And I found this discussion to be theek hai, all right, aisa hi kuch kisne bola hoga. But if you read the history of where this came from, well, the US, basically when women started working in the World War, immediately GDPs started looking very good because obviously women started working and their work started getting counted. And then people started saying, well, then what about pre-work where they're not doing anything, right? And so why GDP is described in a certain way, what it takes into account, has a history. which is very specific to the developed world. The fact that it doesn't work in India is, of course, because it's for informal economies, a very strange concept, which we have developed. So I think movements in this direction, having more specific variables, more specific models, which are about issues that we think are important for our country or the global south in general. I think that is basically going to be the new thing that you should see.
So let me break it up in two parts. One, which is what questions we want to ask and what analytical tools we use, right? And so the first, one of the things I'm hearing makes me wonder whether it was a good idea to move the Department of Economics out of the, because economics has always been a very imperial discipline. Right? You don't have, other disciplines are sort of catching up, but we have never restricted our questions to just markets. And we go way back in the 1950s, actually earlier, 1940s, von Mises, the project, something called, along with Hayek, a branch of economics that's often not considered mainstream, called Austrian economics. Wrote this book called Human Action. Right? So if you look at economics as a theory of human action, then anything is available for inquiry. So that's as far as the questions are concerned, right? And we have, I mean, why do people commit crime? Why do people marry somebody or not marry somebody? Why do they have kids? All of that stuff are questions investigated by economists. Often, as Abhiroop said, with complete ignorance of what other disciplines are saying about it. Now comes the issue of, and the second is, I think, a little bit on what Shailaja spoke yesterday about framing. And what I hear from both Mausumi and Bhanu is, if you're going to go down the road of culture, and you want to sort of distill that into, there are two issues that I would sort of focus on. One is, as Mausumi said, the preference structure. Right? Essentially, should you boil down culture into the structure of preferences, which would then sort of also drive the other issue that Bhanu, I think, sort of brought out very nicely about expectations and how that affects how you're thinking about various things, your response functions. But then, as Abhiroop said, what is the manner in which we think about, if we're actually going to measure culture, how do you go about doing it? One of the things that's changed with the advent of machine learning is now text has become data. Previously, data was just numbers. Now text has become data. Because previously, remember, your Likert scales and structures are all about converting something into a numerical value. Right? Now, if you can think about the ways in which, and this is where the analytical tool story comes in, how does that then, can you represent from imagery in films, from literature, is there a way of measuring culture through those kinds of methods? And then that is not really, I think, to my mind, an economic question in the way we have thought about it. It may be an economic question in the Mises variety, but it's definitely not an economic question that you can start framing or answering if you only talk to other economists. Which is then why I said it was a good idea to be there or not there, right? So that's one of the things that we need to think about. So the method story then becomes an important part of the story as to how you took it forward. The second issue of the method story that you said, and it relates back to the crisis and so on, and again goes back into the way we are doing modeling now. As Abhiroop said, causality is, people are asking, if prediction is good, should I worry about causality? So if you go down that path, and one of the reasons you go down that path is because when you work with models, you don't know what the inner working of those models are. So LLM models have no idea why they're producing what they're producing yet, right? So it's very difficult to do causality out of that particular story. So what does it mean then in one of the advantages of the GFC was once the failure happened, I was able to go back and relook at the way I analyze structures, whether Rubini or otherwise, and say, okay, maybe I did this stuff wrong. But if essentially that is a black box, and yes, then when the failure happens, I don't know, I have no way of figuring out why the failure is happening. And hence, that movement forward, if you, in the method space, if you're unable to figure out why something is happening, that makes it very problematic. And this is why, even in the main sciences, if you look at a lot of the medical sciences, or even you sort of see an effect, and you often might end up, which is where the RCT stuff comes from, you might end up approving drug structures based on those kinds of stories, because the external validity problem is much less given what we know about human physiology. But then there's a lot of research that keeps on happening, is to try and understand why that drug is working on that particular disease. The drug may be approved before you know what that story is. But the structure of inquiry and the model allows you to keep asking the question, why is it working? My worry about the way we are going forward is I'm not sure the way we are modeling will allow us to ask that question. And if it doesn't, then I'm not sure where we'll end up as a discipline. Thank you.
Yeah. To my mind, I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate in saying that, to my mind, the contribution of economic stream in terms of a rational choice framework and in terms of perfect market hypotheses are important in terms of setting the benchmark. Because to my mind, any deviation, and the real cases are going to deviate from that, we need a comparison point. We need something, a fixed point, so to speak, to which we can say that, okay, this is my structure, this is what in an ideal world will happen, but it's not happening, so how far we are and exactly how we are different. So I think the problem that you're talking about I think the economic stream, that was, to my mind, that would be the main contribution of the economic stream as it were to begin with. But I think where we went wrong probably is that when we started believing in this structure, started taking it too seriously, in the sense that we forgot that this is only a framework as a benchmark. This is not the real world. So to my mind, therefore, big data and AI and all this are probably very useful, keeping in mind this benchmark, keeping in mind, try to figure out exactly, more data tells us exactly how far we are and where we are, different. And I think that helps us, and that's going forward is going to be an important way to, the stream can progress. And as Partha said, we have already made correction. Of course, the perfect market hypothesis didn't work. There was crisis. We had Great Depression earlier also. We had, so every crisis tells us exactly how the, benchmark is sort of, you should think about adding layers to that benchmark. And I think that's important. But without a benchmark, I feel that it's going to be a sort of, it's a free for all. And without a benchmark, I feel that, there's no way to evaluate anything because anything goes. And partly, even though I said, talked about culture, part of my worry as a profession is also that culture can be sort of, it can be anything. The moment I start saying that everything is, goes back to culture, I can also say that, well, the reason why poor people are so poor is because, it's a culture, they're not working hard enough. So therefore, it's a new opening, but I think we should look at it with a lot of caution. And for that, we need, to my mind, we need a sort of a stable benchmark. And I think, to my mind, at least the economic stream has provided such a benchmark, and we should take that only as a benchmark and then think about ways in which we are differing from that benchmark. That would be my take on this.
Yeah. I think with respect to global financial crisis, so we should not forget our own success. I think RBI has done extremely well. In fact, even 2 years before the global financial crisis, RBI started implementing macroprudential norms, and I think that's a big gift to the whole monetary policy framework in the world. And I think there's also a famous statement from Stiglitz, so I don't want to repeat, I think all of you know about it. So in terms of modeling, I've been in this profession for some time now, and I think what is important for us is in terms, I think we need to be a little more eclectic than the way we have our own rigidities in terms of modeling. I think that is one big lesson that I've learned for the past two decades. So you need to be more eclectic so that you can adapt to the changing situations, particularly when you're doing modeling, whether it is a macro variables or a micro variables. I think that is one thing that I keep telling to my own students, that you need to don't get wedded to some school and be eclectic so that you are more flexible and you can actually adapt much better. And I think another lesson that we learned is that look at the error behaviors. Partha identified some of them, but error behaviors are very important if you want to really go back and use those same kind of models for. Ultimately, models have to be forward-looking, okay? And if it is not forward-looking, I don't think that's very useful. But there are some cases where theories definitely help, but I think ultimately it comes back to how eclectic is your model. Just thought passingly I want to tell this. Last 1 month, you know which paper is downloaded most? It is the Harry Johnson's paper on theory of tariffs and retaliations, 1958. Okay, so something will stay for long, something will stay up part of the cycle, something will be out of the picture because of the cycles. So I think students need to be more adaptable and flexible and eclectic with their approach.
Just to follow up on, like, a lot of discussions came up on the big data and the artificial intelligence converting the text as a data now. Now, do you see that, and the way the text is analyzed and the way we economics, we are trained to analyze economic data is so different. Do you see that there is an end of econometrics now? That's the modelers. I know Bhanu works on macroeconomic modeling, so what does he...
So, I keep looking at these recent developments, but don't mistake me that I got wedded to structural modeling. I always look at experiments by, looking at some of the recent advances. I think a decade ago, we had this DSG modeling, right? That was so popular in the Europe, then there a lot of pressure on us to really adopt. But I think it all depends on what kind of data that you have. I mean, you cannot really fit whatever data you have with some of the recent advances. So DSG model actually failed in the country. I mean, not only in our country, but across. But then in between, there was a lot of fashion adopting DSG models. And we still, in my view, I think the kind of databases that we have, we still feel that structural modeling is much more useful. But I think at the same time, you need to really, customize it. But in terms of big data, again, there's so much of experiments going on. There are some papers coming out, but I was also referring some of the papers. But still, I'm not convinced that that would be a answer for predicting what happens tomorrow. So it will be one of the predictors, but ultimately the basics should be the structural modeling.
No, I'll skip.
No, quickly, I definitely don't see the sort of passing of econometrics in the sense that it's another source of data. So, for example, let's say what Bhanu just said, right? Is it possible that if I look at number of the financial journalists talking about something, stories published in the media, and I look at it for the past year, and I'm looking for certain frequencies of terms, etc. Is that something that enables me to predict sentiment structures going forward versus the other metrics that we're actually using? Is there something latent in the way people are describing things that gives you information? So this is all of it is about everything is about you're predicting an outcome, conditioning on an information set. What you've done is essentially enlarge that information set. And the techniques that we're now using are basically trying to figure out how do you measure that information set and make it measurable and analyze it. So, new techniques, certainly, but the thrust of basically what that structures is, we're essentially trying to figure out a conditional mean on something or the other. That doesn't change.
Yeah, I talk about this all the time since I teach econometrics at ISI with my students. So I think that, to me, machine learning is another kind of hi-fi version of non-parametrics, pretty much econometrics, right? And, we could not do non-parametrics for a long time because we didn't have enough data. Now we can do non-parametric and even better than non-parametric. So I think that, what econometrics is, again, it itself is a huge field. I think it flows very easily to these ideas of machine learning. I think what will die, and this is what I tell my students, is essentially open a data set and run y equal to beta 1 plus beta 2x plus beta 3x kind of models with no thought on. So one way is you keep the model simple, but then think creatively about causality. So while I said causality is not the only thing, but if you want to move in that direction, then think in that direction. The linearity of things is because a lot of causal things, we know some methods of how to identify difference in means or conditional means. That is by force, in some sense, we take linear models. But if you are basically in a model where at the end of the regression you will say, okay, mother's education matters, this also matters, that is also matters, then why stop at a linear model in parameters? I mean, you can run your favorite machine learning thing, the interpretation of each of the coefficients will be exactly the same. It will be non-causal, it will be something that in some sense has some bearing on the problem. No, that, so I think that part of econometrics is going to go. Okay. Now, can you still do that kind of econometrics? I think you can do in the spirit of many of the EPW articles, which used to basically just have a table of means, would then have a lot of depth in the narrative that they had. So the tables did not show, but the tables were consistent with a deeper view, which was very informed from literature, from field work, from working with the government, so on and so forth, right? And for many important issues, those were enough. I think some of those papers in 60s, 70s, 80s in EPW are in fact shown to be correct, even by later methods. It's just that knowledge of an issue, in some sense, always trumps some statistical method that can come out of nowhere. That's my belief. I think increasingly, of course, there are biases, and that is why, that's the reason why causal econometrics has come up. But I think if you present it to enough number of people who work on the sector, if you are biased, they will point out that is because of the bias and not because it's some absolute statement. So the part of econometrics, so again, linear regression, simple, will remain if you invest a lot in the issue, right? It will be a sideshow where you kind of say things are consistent. And causal econometrics will remain. There will be some bells and whistles of, heterogeneity with some ML method, things like those are all like bells and whistles, right? But this idea that you can just run a regression, even for macro, linear model, run a regression and say, well, this affects that affects this affects that. I think that people will not accept it anymore. Because of course the stages, you'll be sitting with a computer scientist, he'll say, I can do this with no assumptions at all. Yeah, it's just like fully non-parametric. And you say, no, I've assumed that this is beta x plus beta 2. Oh, I have x square. That sometimes becomes very funny. You say, oh, I have some x square or x cube or some polynomial. Those are, now computation methods have moved way beyond that. So we should internalize this when we do our econometrics.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe we are running out of time. Can I take one last? Or should we just wind it? This I want to come to the micro part. We have not touched on the microeconomics. Now, the way we came from the mass for ICE, for example, intentional combustion engine, and all that processes led to the economies of mass production. Now, the way the world is moving, we are no longer doing this mass production, especially after this deglobalization and Trump and tariffs. I feel that there would not be any mass production anymore. So that is one question. So basically, should we then move out of the capitalist kind of framework that we started off with, right, in the economic systems? That's one question. And second, would there be an increase in the market power concentration because of this, the data process, the new regime, the AI, which is much more expensive, and it would be held in the hands of few people? So should we then rewrite microeconomics? That's the question.
I do microeconometrics, so maybe I can. Yeah, I think that, I think all issues you talk about are already there in the literature. It's not like anything people have not talked about market power through some kind of technology or something. I think, where I see a slight kind of, I would say, the link missing, which I guess neoclassical or rational expectations people try to do, which is to have a clear connection between the microeconomic decision and the macroeconomic outcomes. This is the part that, has worked for the US for some time. And also I think still works by and large. You have to realize that economics is not supposed to have failed in the US. In the Fed, there is an economist who sits and is making a contribution which is appreciated. I think the micro-macro link is missing for emerging countries, where we are here, basically, estimating Minserian regressions of returns to education from only wage labor, where only 30% of people have wage labor, right? And then talking about GDP and then something happening to productivity. And so, all this micro to macro link in India is very, very weak. And that is something that we will have to do. It will not come from just picking up, some of these models outside, because many of the things, the 80% of US labor has got wage labor. For them to think about wages is the most natural way to think about it. We have self-employed. Maybe that's not the way we should think about it. But then, write down a micro model of entrepreneurs and what they are doing, and then linking it up to investments and so on and so forth is hard. But that's why we have all these people. So you guys need to do it. We are looking forward to it.
Quick, so mass customization, right? It's happening all the time in your social media. Each of you get stuff that's customized to you, and it's controlled by very few companies. Why shouldn't that happen for goods? Your flavor of toothpaste could be exactly the flavor, that mix that you want, because it's possible to do that. The shape of your car seat can be exactly based on what you are, right? That's what printing does. So fundamentally, what seems so obvious and natural to you, to have a small number of firms giving you customized digital consumption, could be the same for customized physical consumption, the extent that physical consumption matters. Right? So it isn't, how does that change economics and economic analysis and perfect markets? That assumption is the next question. As Abhiroop said, that's for the people in front of us to figure that part of the story out. So, and the other story is, as I said, yes, we are now very low on wage labor, but it's exactly what the deorganization story is happening is, you're getting to the same, so 20 years from now, the US labor market may look exactly like the Indian labor market. And so then you sort of ask yourself, would the nature of analysis change? And it might. But maybe there is something that we are doing now here that will help them understand what's happening over there. Right? So that's the nature of taxation. Definitely the recent story on Trump equalizing VAT and tariffs is an interesting thing. I haven't really thought through that issue, but fundamentally he's saying, if other people's tax systems are different from my tax system, I'm going to sort of assume that they are structured in a particular fashion. So it is these kinds of now tensions of systemic differences that will come into being, and how that affects our modeling is something that people who do that much more frequently than I do need to think.
Yeah, so I'll take your question in a sort of a historical context. So imagine that, at the beginning of Industrial Revolution, you move from a putting out system to a factory production, right? And that actually led to a lot of market power in some sense. So if now, because of the technological improvement, we are sort of going back to a sort of, as Partha was saying, sort of a local, from global to local is probably a buzzword now. So a local best consumer as well as production system, because technology might allow you to do that. You don't no longer want people to be, to congregate in a factory space. It can, it can happen from your home and all that. So I think that's kind of, completing the circle, but with a very distinct difference, which is that the amount of goods and services, the kind of goods and services that you can produce, the variety of goods and services that you can produce now has completely changed, and you don't need a mass production unit to do that. So to my mind, that probably, if that's how the technology and AI are going to help us, I mean, why not? Why do we want mass production? Was an idea of a particular way in which technological change happened long time back. Now it's going to move in a very different direction, and that probably is going to give rise to more decentralization, and which, to my mind, as long as it's kind of, it's accessible to everybody, it's a good thing. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to lead to more market power. We don't know that yet, because technology has been becoming, the way it has been developing, it's becoming more and more accessible to everybody. So probably the idea is not to think about this technological development as concentration of power, but as an enabling factor. But to what extent that happens probably depends a lot on public policies and government policies. So that's an open question. And that was true during Industrial Revolution as well.
Let me just quickly add a quick thought. So what we just said, you're looking at, so you have DeepSeek and you have OpenAI, right, story. And so the fact that I can print something, a car seat in your place, is a set of instructions. The IP is in that set of instructions. Now, if to the extent that IP is held by a firm, a single firm, with one firm manufacturing car seats for everybody around the world, but if that instruction set is quote-unquote democratized or more made open source, then anybody can in some sense start doing this. So how you deal with IP in that space might then determine what, and that's going to be a story. Right? So the one firm, people get worried about the single guy doing so much, having power, and therefore you say, no, it's okay to hack into and figure out that code. And that's not criminal, that's not a violation of law. Because laws are what is criminal and what is not criminal is what we say it is. And therefore, the nature of how that IP is controlled might differ. And that might then affect what the structure of the market is. So it's actually a brave new world out there. So you guys are going to have a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I think we have had very, very interesting discussion. And thank you all for being so nice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, as a token of our appreciation, so that you keep coming to the department.
Physical goods.
Physical.
Yeah.
I thought all of you sort of,
Virtual.
tell us nice things on our social media, and that's how you get the... Yes. Who knows what inflation is? What is inflation? Right? No. Thank you.
Partha, let me say, the idea of coming out of the department.
Scenario. This panel discussion is organized to create a platform for dialogue between industry and academia. We are honored to have our esteemed panelists for today. Mr. Mahesh Vyas, Managing Director and CEO of Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, CMIE. Dr. Ajit Ranade, former Vice-Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Dr. Rohinton Medhora, Fellow and former President, Center for International Governance Innovation, Professor of Practice, McGill University, and Chair of the Board, Institute for New Economic Thinking. Mr. Satish Pillai, Non-Executive Director, Credila Financial Services Limited, former MD and CEO, TransUnion Civil Limited, MD, India. Nielsen IQ, co-founder, the company of Four. The panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Aditi Chaubal, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, IIT Bombay. We welcome you to IIT Bombay.
Thank you, Sneha, for the warm introduction. And we welcome all of you, all the esteemed panelists to IIT for the second MYM conference. We are delighted to have such an esteemed panel for the conference and for our young scholars who are here today, who are actually, and that's what drove the theme, challenging perspective of the economic scenario, because these are young scholars who are about to finish either their PhD, senior PhD scholars, or young assistant professors who have already entered academia. So that is what set the tone for this particular theme. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the questions right away in terms of asking each of the panelists the questions, and I'll start with Dr. Medhora. The first question that we have for you, sir, is what do you think are the challenges that the current innovation paradigm poses to the field of economics and firms in government behavior? especially in or so-called field of new industrial policy?
Thank you for having me, and it's good to be back. I was here last year as well, and we talked about much the same things, and the world has changed even in 12 months. I guess to answer your question, I'd present to you a few what I think are stylized facts of new technologies. And I'd say in no particular order of importance, new technologies are characterized by high upfront costs and with that high risk, but also extremely low marginal costs. So if you think of creating software or creating music that is then streamed, whether you have 100 customers or 1,000 or 10,000 or a million, you know, your marginal costs of production are really quite low. But not everyone who makes a music CD or not everyone who creates software succeeds. So high failure rates, but then extremely sweet success. So, I mean, that's of one set of thoughts. The other is, and now we get into perhaps the questions on industrial policy and international issues, there's economies of agglomeration. If you think of where innovation is centered, it's not even in countries. It's in regions within countries. You know, Silicon Valley, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Cambridge, UK, Bangalore, now further north, what's called Silicon Valley in Israel. It's a little dot of a speck of a place, Taiwan. And the reason those regions then become richer is because of this combination of human capital, financial capital, innovation, entrepreneurship, education, quality universities, and so on. And then the third stylized fact, I'd say, would be that strategic behavior through standard setting, through predatory acquisitions, indeed operating through your government in free trade agreements, makes a big difference. And that's because you're essentially a natural monopoly. And so the bigger you are, the better you become. And so there's a natural incentive to want more and more because it's costing you nothing. That also has a political dimension to it, which means, and we're seeing this in the US, where the techno-industrial complex that we've now been warned about by people who were victims of it, is a real thing. And so natural monopolies tend to perpetuate themselves through the political process. So you add all of that up, and I'd say, to answer your question, what's the challenge for economics? And then I'll end with your point about new industrial policy. My sense is that economics has the tools to deal with each of these things separately. You know, if someone asked you, how do you regulate a natural monopoly? All of us could write a one-page sort of answer to that. If someone said, you know, how do you regulate or how do you make up for spillover effects or market failures of some kind? Well, we know what to do. The difference in this case is that we don't have tools to deal with all of these stylized facts happening at the same time. Second, it's the pace of change, which is something in economics we're very poor at dealing with, is dynamics, and especially shifting dynamics. There's we were told not to bring PowerPoint, so of course I haven't, and I don't like them anyway. But there's a very good chart that shows the different growth streams of how long it took the different sub-technologies in AI to reach the level of human competence. And the funny thing is, you know, the initial technologies took maybe 10 or 15 years. And now we find with things like facial recognition, the path is 5 to 7 years. And there's no government in the world that's going to keep up with that kind of change. The Industrial Revolution unfolded over 50, 100 years. the agriculture and prior revolutions, actually over millennia. We're now compressing everything into a decade. I don't think economics is good at that. And then the final point, which I've made already, and I'll stop on that, is economics has moved away from its political economy roots for the most part. And so we haven't fully understood that feedback loop between the growth of intangibles, the growth of innovation sector, how it perpetuates itself, and how it both strengthens and corrupts the political system. So maybe we'll get to industrial policy later.
Thank you for such an interesting overview, and which is very comprehensive across all the different streams of economics and for the diverse group of economists that we have here as well. Just as a follow-up question, and then I'll also ask the other panelists, since you brought up industrial policy as well. How do you think the firms across the world need to evolve? Because we're slowly moving towards this inward-looking protectionist environment, and it's happening sooner than we think. Especially since we have grown into the current setup on the back of these global value chains and globalization. That is what has driven growth so far, and suddenly you have this new concept of inward-looking protectionism, saying, no, capitalize only on what we are good at and don't give it away. So that's sort of a protectionist world that we seem to be moving towards. Since you mentioned a bit about the marginal cost, the high risks and the high cost, but also the low marginal costs. So it'll be interesting to get your views on that, and then I'll also open it up to the other panelists.
So my honest answer would be it's too soon to say. We were talking about this in the tea break. I'm not even convinced that this inward-looking stuff will last. I don't think we can escape it for the next perhaps 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years, I don't know. But at some point, I mean, just take the US and take how Trump has kind of, you were saying how many executive?
64.
64 in
3 weeks.
In 3 weeks. Nothing my country, Canada, can do is going to change his mind. Going to the White House to visit him and so on isn't going to do it. The only thing that's going to do it, because he's got the wind on his back, including his own people. He was legitimately elected. The only thing that's going to change his mind is if his constituency puts pressure on him. Why would it do that? Because at some point, they're going to see higher petrol prices, higher prices of all kinds of goods that use steel and iron, which is to say just about everything, and higher prices when they go to Walmart because they're not buying stuff made cheaply in China, and on and on. At that point, I think this fetish on tariffs will come to an end because the MAGA base will force it. So that's the US. Your broader question was, how do firms adapt? Depends where you are, right? I'd say if you're a firm in a large country, then there's a series of measures that make the internal market more dominant. In a country like China, and I wouldn't speak for India, I wouldn't know, there's other, it's been overdue, the shift from export-based to actually raising domestic consumption. So if you're in the US, if you're in China, Brazil, India, you seek domestic markets and so on. If you're in a small, open economy, I honestly don't know. I think this is going to be a huge conundrum, and they just have to wait it out. Or if you're Taiwan or Israel, you have a special relationship, or with China. China is actively wooing countries in its backyard. If you have a special relationship with a hegemon, then that's what gets you to where you are. But that, I think, is going to be it. But I'm not a big fan of this deglobalization. I think there are aspects of globalization that needed to change, but I think we've seen so many of the benefits of it that consumers at some point are going to recognize that the pendulum swung too much the other way, and we need to come back. Final point, how would firms react to this? I would assume they'd be lobbying their governments for protection of some kind, whether it's out-and-out support, whether it's protection, whether it's export subsidies to seek markets in zones that are not protective. I don't know, but I think the firm government nexus is going to become tighter.
Dr. Ranade, following up on that because he gave the global perspective, what would you think would be, say, the view of, say, the Indian economy in a similar vein, wherein we are looking increasingly, we've now had to have dialogue and in-person dialogue regarding some of the usual trade structures which were matter-of-factly earlier, but now suddenly we're looking at, no, we need to engage with some of these countries more, because otherwise we are headed towards a tech Cold War in terms of saying that each country that capitalizes on its own merits is therefore going to try to hide from the others, hide its IP, etc., and from the others. So in terms of this protectionist sort of world that we seem to be entering, what would your take be on firms, Indian firms, for example, to react to this?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Aditi. But allow me to, first of all, quickly comment for the sake of everybody in the audience. When they say meeting of young minds, it means minds. So, please remember that minds don't get old. So a young mind refers to mind of everybody, including us on the panel. Just wanted to, that is one thing. Yeah, you can clap, you can clap. Secondly, when it says frontiers of economics, the kind of economics we are in the middle of, everything in economics is a frontier. Everything is churning, so everything is a frontier. So just wanted to make sure that. And one more comment, Mr. Chow En-lai was the #2 guy to Mao Zedong. Sometime in the late 1950s, they asked him, what do you think of the French Revolution, 1789? So he said apparently it's too early to tell. So when Dr. Rohinton said it's too soon to tell, I was reminded of that. So it'll take a long time. I believe that the current president of the USA is a very transactional guy, and he just wants a good quid pro quo deal for his country. I don't think there is a grand plan. As you know, that he won a decisive victory, electoral victory. It's quite decisive compared to 2016. And now he has what is called the trifecta. He controls the White House, he controls the Senate, he controls the House of Representatives, and fourth, he also controls the judiciary. 2/3 of the judiciary in the Supreme Court are conservative appointees who will go his way. So he's in a much stronger position. But more importantly, now the percentage of people who support Mr. Trump's policies is 10% higher than the number of people who voted for him. So he's got tremendous support. And the 5 things that I think he supports, one is tariffs, protectionist tariffs. Second is on immigration. Third is on all this global expenditure on wars everywhere. Fourth is on big tech, but excluding Tesla and Twitter. He wants to take on Facebook, and the fifth is on fiscal situation, the very high debt and high deficit. So when you say protectionist, I think it's just, he's saying tit for tat. It's very appealing. So I don't think there's a grand plan. Even during the first presidency of Trump, he took office on 20th January 2017 and immediately slapped 25% import duty on Chinese steel and aluminum, and also European stuff and South Korea. But around the same time, the Chinese delivered a fully built, made in China ocean liner to America. Ocean liner, which is a big deal. And bilateral trade was already around $700 billion during the time of Trump, high tariffs then. So even today, and actually the Chinese trade deficit has gone up in the meantime. So COVID was an interregnum. So for all the talk of protectionism, at least on the trade front, I think the trade patterns are showing that they're not showing significant reverse correction. And I feel the reason he has so much support in the US, maybe it's ephemeral, electoral things, in 2019, the ruling party had a thumping majority in parliament, but the same party had 0 votes in the assembly elections in Delhi state, just a few months later. So how electors behave is very difficult to say. So I don't know whether this Trump support will sustain, because we'll have the midterm elections to the Congress and so on. But I think the reason is because I feel that the sentiment is that the US is open, US markets are open for everybody, and but all other trading partners, their markets are don't have the same ease of access to US producers. So it's just a very basic, very transactional way of saying. So we of course call it protectionist, and we say he doesn't understand that if you go back to the Bretton Woods, the whole idea was special and different. Developing countries need a little higher level of tariffs, so on and so forth. But that was 1940s, and we are in 2025. So Mr. Trump says, hey, we can't use the same logic anymore. You better open your markets, otherwise we're going to be reciprocal. So I think on the trade front, but essentially the broader background message is that the WTO is dying. I mean, it's really dying. The three basic foundational principles of WTO are, number one, that MFN, that if you're treating a countries in a manner, you have to give the same treatment to all countries. So if goods from a country X are coming at this duty, you can't be selective and differential. So that is the first foundational principle of WTO. The second principle is that once the goods enter your borders, they should be treated the same as domestic goods. So if an American bourbon whiskey has come inside India's borders, then it should be treated like any other whiskey. Meaning you can't continue to discriminate against it because it's a foreign-made thing. And the third foundational principle is dispute resolution. All these three are being, when you say tit for tat, it's just being, all foundational principles are being shaken up. And in any case, the dispute resolution mechanism has been broken for the last 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. So I think it's a long answer basically, but I think protectionism is what should I say? It's not as big a deal as it's thought to be. But the bigger deal is what you said, the other part, which is the tech Cold War. I think as we are basically in a tech Cold War. So this is Cold War 2.0, but this is not about bullets and tanks and aircrafts. It's about tech, which means that the whole world is going to have to choose very soon whether you are in the Sinosphere or in the other sphere. I don't know what to call it. I don't know what to call it, the Yankee sphere. So if you are in the Sinosphere, you don't have YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram or WhatsApp and so on. So you have to, increasingly they are going to be sort of sealed, and not only in terms of the sort of in the virtual sense, but also they are now not going to allow them access to chips or 5G, 6G or space technology and so on. So that is where I think things are unfolding. And DeepSeek has been a kind of a wake-up call that all this talk of the Chinese, it's just, I saw a photograph of Mr. Xi Jinping shaking hands with that guy. What's his name? Leung, the DeepSeek founder. So he just had a conference with all these private sector guys in China. And the guys who worked on DeepSeek, none of them has ever been out of China. And they've all been trained in China. So it's not as if they stole IPR from somewhere. So I think that's the bigger story, according to me. So I'm not so worried about protectionism. Of course, it will be disruptive. Of course, for India, since we are not, geared up, and we'll do some transactional things. We'll do tit for tat. We'll try to reduce whiskey is gone, Harley Davidson, maybe something else will go down, and that will be violating certain WTO rules. But WTO is anyway, is in a bad shape. So my concern is not so much about the trade tariff war, it's more about this tech Cold War.
Thank you so much for that interesting, both of the panelists have given this idea that, well, it's not a protectionist world that we seem to be heading towards, and that is something which will normalize in terms of the tit-for-tat strategies. So Dr. Pillai, Mr. Pillai, I would like to ask you on that front, what would your take be on this tech Cold War? Because it seems like some of these smaller countries can then, including China, China is not small, but hold some of these larger nations. So the example I'm trying to give is Taiwan. Can hold some of these larger nations hostage just because of these IP issues, the WTO getting dismantled at some point, and entering a totally different tech Cold War era.
Yeah, so I think from a tech perspective, probably about 4 or 5 different ways to look at tech. It's not one homogeneous blob in some ways. Stuff around hardware that's actually happening, which is probably easier to control. As you saw the example of DeepSeek, there is limitations to it. there's a natural outcome of protectionism is when you ensure that a certain chip cannot be sold to China, they have to make sure that the lower grade chips are actually performing better, actually helps DeepSeek use the best version of the old chips in some ways, right? So there is an accidental benefit that you get when you start protecting, which has happened here. But I think, so there is a hardware piece of it that is actually there. The second is actually, this Cold War is also around capital, and saying who actually holds capital and where is the easiest access to risk capital, which still is compared to Europe. US is, still a lot of funny and crazy money running after funny and crazy ideas, right? And the hypothesis is the more money you throw at it, and I'm not just talking about AI in general, saying it actually get better results. China able to do that to some extent, to lower scale has a benefit, and even from an India standpoint. So I think some of these stories are old stories, firstly. I think I would generally agree with both of them in terms of saying that there are events happening and they're happening at a frightening pace, but there have been things that have been going on for a while that are also, there might be certain non-linearity, but there is a curve of change rather than a big event of change or something has happened, right? I think all the stuff that's developing around AI was there. I think the story is yet to be written. So I would also, in my mind, I don't think it is a Cold War or separation. There are enough countries ambivalent, not taking sides. Ours could be one, too, which is not necessarily saying that this side or that. And I think the rules are not yet written in terms, especially on the technology landscape, of what are these emerging technologies. And I'll just explain through an example that there is a lot of interest, obviously, around LLMs and AI as is automation. There's a lot working for it. Is there a lot of automation possible? Are there many companies using it? Is agentic AI real? Absolutely, that's right. So would you be in the business today, or would you support businesses that are going to be building the next range of foundational models, a la DeepSeek or something else? You could, but my guess is when you actually get a lead in these things for 3 or 4 years, it's harder and harder to build foundational models. You tend to get into a space which exists right now, which is application, right? So what is the application of these large language models? What are the applications, the creation of small language models? What are the applications where you start looking at domains, trying to go deep in it? And I think instead of saying that are we going to create the next DeepSeek, it's important to saying is India or any other country going to create an application that is unique. The situation at the context of India is dramatically different. The context in rural India, urban India, regional, we are incredibly heterogeneous, and I don't mean that culturally, I mean that economically, right? To try and figure out where that applies, I think that's where the innovation is going to come from, that's where the ideations will come from. And that I think is going to be a level of specialization across countries and group of countries will happen, where there are few countries specializing more from a foundational model, some of the applications, some on the specific, protein folding specialization, medical specialization. That is going to happen. So I think it's important to start separating that as the old Cold War was more around nuclear proliferation and trying to look at power that way. I think the specialization in exports across countries, imports for others, how that has specialized across countries and what has normalized over the last 100 years, the same thing happens from a tech standpoint, product creation, not just services. And I think that's a room there right now that is available for that to happen. That kind of diffuses this one extreme or the other. That's kind of my view on at least the change in the IT side.
Just to follow up on that, since you brought up AI and DeepSeek, we've not seen a lot of investment per se. So for example, let me give you the context of tech in the 90s and 80s. India ended up investing at that time in software and computers, and you had Infosys, TCS coming up around that time, which actually propelled us into the future in terms of putting us on the map, global map. With respect to the AI, artificial intelligence argument, do you think India has made enough of an investment or forward-looking scenario in which we will be one of the disruptors, or will we always be playing the catch-up game?
So, two types of investments, obviously, is public and private. From a public standpoint, I think a lot of these things that we're talking about are private investment. Public is enablement, and I think we're going to talk through what will make it easier for risk capital to come in India, a lot more deployed on these things, and many things around. Is it easy to do business in India? Is it easy to set up a business in India? How painful it is to go on a GSTN portal. Anybody who's done that probably loses part of their life, unfortunately. It's just painful. So there is challenges in terms of doing that? Is there enablement that can allow an environment? I think you would say that it does or not. My bigger challenge, I think, right now is risk capital. Is there enough risk capital? So a DeepSeek example, I think people look at it, the numbers they quoted was not the full cost, right? They didn't talk a lot in terms of pre-training cost. So if you add that up, let's say $50, $60 million, and not everybody who spends $50, $60 million ends up with this stuff. So if you're saying it's $50, $60 million, is that risk capital available for in India that people would actually invest it, multiply by 4, 5? So there has to be a private investment. And the second thing is, where would you get, from a return standpoint, is that the best thing that you would do or not? Are you willing to take this chance of 1 in 300? That's the challenge. I think that has to be a there. And the second thing is the opportunity cost of return. So saying, if I have to invest $1, am I going to do it there or something else that can give more? I think the latter is still in India, which is largely underinvested, and you can find any sector, and you can find opportunities for growth. There are enough people, I worked a lot in the financial services background, they talk about if you don't grow at 25%, there's something wrong with you. And most people would probably die in saying that's just like riding a tiger. But there are cases of saying 25% growth is possible. So you start thinking of those returns as saying, should I be doing this or not? So I don't think it's availability of capital, not just of Indians, of people wanting to invest in India. That's there. Look at private equity and it's there. It's just the question of the willingness to take that risk on return. From a capability standpoint, my view is I think it's not a 1-0 problem of creating the next DeepSeek or GPT and killing LLMs to death. They're saying, where's the innovation of usage? That is an applicability which is unique to the experience of the Indian consumer or the Indian entrepreneur or the Indian small business, which cash flows are very different, where the economy is structured very, very differently, and you cannot imagine that everybody's salaried employees therefore should have products that are to do with once in a month and so on. That transformation I think is important. Anywhere that makes a big difference to get healthcare to rural parts of India, not through just telemedicine, I mean actual healthcare available. How do you make that possible would be awesome. And lastly, I would say, I would submit that everybody look at the AI revolution in terms of how it had made making things cheaper and faster. So IT companies, data companies existed. They now found it much cheaper, much faster to do things that used to take an inordinate amount of time. That's democratization that actually helps. The question, what the usage comes to. I think that's where I would make the distinction.
Thank you so much for that, and I believe we have many economists who have, in our audience, who have also used some of these AI tools, ML tools, for some of their research. And I believe that's the answer in terms of saying rather than the DeepSeek, it's more about what problems in India are we able to address using some of these advanced tools. Mr. Vyas, coming to you with respect to the AI angle of it for the businesses in particular, since you also do look at these big data sets, how have you seen AI changing businesses and how has the evolution been taking place in businesses, in particular with respect to changes in business models, as well as to answer the same question, would it be some of these firms end up playing the catch-up game, or would there be some sort of niche that they would end up having at the end of this?
Okay, thank you. I think the answer is the same that I heard earlier. It's too early to tell. I see lots of companies dabbling into, investing into AI applications. Not all of them, of course. I mean, most of them have these things under wraps. Nobody's going to tell you what he is or she is doing exactly on investment into AI. But we know that almost everybody, depending upon their scale, is doing something. You see it in some applications when you open an app and see what's being done. You can see what's going on behind over there, that this has got an AI kind of application behind there. So I think every company that is not into merely, doing some small processing, any company that is large enough, is reasonably large and is dealing with a lot of information, is trying to find its sweet spot into applying AI tools. And they're all doing it at different levels. If you ask me, is anyone investing into being immensely, fundamentally innovative on that? That's going to be an exceptional case. The larger, broader scenario is going to be people improving their operations, people improving their marketing, people improving their, basic distribution, etc. That's where the application is. And that's where we're seeing it going. Dealing with customers, dealing with distribution is where AI is being deployed. We being in the information business, even we are investing into similar applications, seeing how we can make life easier for ourselves, for our customers. That's what I see. So, firms are not uniform. So unlike, say, households, where there is much higher uniformity in the sample, firms are necessarily log normal distribution. You have very large firms, you have a large number of mid-sized firms, and then you have an extremely large number of very small firms. The small firms are not going to innovate. They're going to see what they can do with what's coming their way. They also have a very high attrition rate. So, completely new small firms will be born in the new environment that we see. Mid-sized firms will struggle to adapt. And their whole story is to adapt. They will burn some money, they'll burn some resources, they will hire some smart guys. They'll see that getting just one or two smart guys does not work. So there's a learn curve going on over there. And of course, the very large companies are going to see what they can do. So it's still, I think it's still a gamble. The returns are, there are some clear returns in applications, but the big game, I think, is unknown. So the big game, we require to wait and watch.
You've already brought us to the next part, which I was envisaging, where you spoke about getting or hiring people with certain skill sets, which is going to be the need of the hour. So that brings us to the next element of this conversation, which is labor, especially in the Indian economy, including globally. There is this conversation which has started in terms of labor, and in India it is absolutely important, regarding how do you think the labor capital relation is going to then change on the back or on the heels of this AI transformation. Because like you rightly pointed out, firms will be hiring, but now you're going to look at a totally different skill set. So therefore, given India's demographic dividend and given the fact that it's not a unilateral sort of economy where everyone has the same skill set, and we do have issues in terms of education, health, and those drivers as well, how do you think the labor capital relationship is going to change as a result of AI entering the picture?
So I can see the situation with respect to labor, and it's most interesting over there. The relationship between capital and labor is a little more complex, and maybe I'll dwell on that a little. But what is most interesting is that we saw this beautiful dividend that the country got in the IT boom in the 1990s, and that has played out for a very long time. We saw it through the dot-com boom thereafter, and we saw it not only in IT, but you go back to the 1990s, and we saw that we had enough good labor capital to supply to not only the IT companies, but even the finance companies. So financial markets saw this huge supply of fairly good labor, entertainment, retail industry. So there's an entire spectrum, whether it is distribution or marketing or entertainment or IT, you had people of good quality who got good quality jobs and provided good quality services. Today, you see their application lesser. But still, it's in very remarkable places. So we have the GCCs, and you have the multinationals who are hiring our best brains to set up tens of thousands of people being hired in their GCCs. So I think there is good quality labor still available. I think it is much lesser than the kind that we saw earlier. And I think the problem over there is GCCs come in a very specialized way, in a very niche kind of way, where the demand comes from overseas. This is not as broad spectrum as we had in the 1990s and the 2000s, where we had IT and entertainment and finance and the whole lot over there being avenues where bright, young kids could find exciting good jobs and exciting careers. I think that space has got limited because the investment cycle is not good enough. So the investments into whether it's the manufacturing sector or even the services sector is a little constrained. It could have been more broad-based, and then we would have seen a lot more people coming up. Now here, I'll dwell into the other problem, that enterprise says that we want labor, but we don't get enough labor. It's not just the Larsen and Toubro saying he can't find construction workers, but it's even other entrepreneurs who say that we want a large sales team and I can't find a large sales team. I can't find people who can speak correct English or write correct English or do some simple tasks clearly. At the same time, we have a large unemployment rate, we have a very low employment rate, and therefore, we have this problem. People who want jobs cannot find jobs, and people who require labor cannot find the labor. So there clearly is a growing mismatch between what our industries are looking for and what our educational institutions are throwing up, at least on quantity. I mean, we do get good quality students finding good quality jobs, but the numbers are not matching. And I think India requires to invest a fairly large amount into solving this problem by recognizing it, by researching it, and trying to solve the problem.
So just to follow up on that, how do you think the employability needs to be changed or looked at?
It seems to be a bigger problem on the educational system. Many economists have written about this wonderfully to explain the problem, that our problem is killing. So everyone wants to do a normal graduation, maybe a BCom or a BSc or a BA or some such thing, and the skilling levels are very low, but you land up doing a job which is that more of a plumber or that of maybe something similar. So you've done a 12th standard education in science and you land up being a delivery boy. There's a huge mismatch over there. I'm just making up the example, but you know what I'm trying to get at? Is that there is a huge gap between what our educational system is delivering, what the parents are aspiring their children to be, and what they land up being. Everyone wants to get a government job that's not available. Everyone wants that, and it doesn't matter what you do in that government job. I may be a BSc, a biology PhD. I'm still willing to take a railway Khalasi job. I'm just making it up, but nevertheless, this is really the drift. So the disconnect between your education, the disconnect between what you have learnt in school and what you aspire to or what your parents and society aspires you to become is hugely disconnected. So what do we need to do? We need to invest into getting this problem right, that right from primary school, Pratham shows us so many times that students of 6th class can't read a 3rd class essay. So there's something broken in the education system right from primary education through high school, through higher levels of school, and that's what is hurting. When the entrepreneurs are looking for people of good quality in large numbers, the large banks who come to India looking to set up GCCs will take the cream away, give them dollar wages, and it will starve the rest of the industry from hiring people. So the investment needs to be made in the entire chain of education to solve the problem.
Professor Ranade, to follow up on that, in terms of not just AI taking up our jobs, but to answer this broader question of it being a demand-supply issue with respect to employability and education related to the employability, what would your views be with respect to saying that, yes, they take away the cream and that is all that they currently need, given that they have some of these AI tools and technology. Therefore, they don't seem to need, these firms don't seem to need as much of, as a number of the labor force to carry out their operations. So therefore, then it speaks towards a broader issue of not just quality of education, but also employability, the lack of jobs, and the broader issue of unemployment in the economy. What would your views be on that?
So anecdotally, I know that some law firms who used to hire in big numbers from leading law schools, by the way, every year 15 to 20 very bright law graduates, big law firms in Mumbai, let's say, they don't hire anymore. Of course, these are all people who do corporate law. They don't do litigation. They don't go to court because they feel that the AI is serving their needs. So that's just anecdotal. So certainly it's affecting. But it's a very severe indictment of our education sector. So since we are in a very premier educational institution, I think we should squarely face it and acknowledge that on one hand, the firms are saying we can't find skilled people. On the other hand, we have large numbers of people graduating who are unemployed. In fact, as per the official government data, between the ages of 24 and 29, those who have a college degree, the unemployment rate is 30%, 30, officially. God knows if it's more. And it's a very severe indictment of it. What we, why don't we say it in plain words? It means that what the education institutions are putting out is simply useless to the people who want to hire. So it's not their fault. It's the fault of the curriculum. It's fault of, we have faculty members sitting here, so I'm careful what I want to say. That why is the curriculum not up to date? In fact, when you revise curriculum, you're not supposed to revise it to today's needs. You're supposed to revise it to the next, you have to forecast the needs of tomorrow. So there was a very long time when Bombay University simply didn't have courses on, say, avionics, or whatever, hospitality related to aviation. So private, Kingfisher set up their own school to train hospitality in airlines, something. And therefore, banks, Nachiket Moore used to be the number 2 guy in ICICI Bank. And he had to go and, with IFMR Chennai, he set up something to, hey, we require large number of people who have banking skills. But, the MA Economics, so MBA, so he went and captive. L&T does that with some IITs, I think. Not Vedanta, the Bharat Forge people, they adopt IT. So they have this, the finance minister of India will say, go and adopt an ITI. But these are all band-aids, we have to face this reality that we are doing. It's a very severe indictment of the educational sector. And the education sector, I'm sorry to say, Mr. Narayan, that it's kind of held hostage by the insiders. Sorry, it's being recorded, so I know that we need to have very, proactive updating curriculums, updating pedagogy, very proactively interacting with industry, interacting with stakeholders. I don't think, maybe it's happening in IIT Bombay, but it's not, on a large scale, it's not happening. And that's where whether we are talking about AI skills or, this is really, and the 3 principles of the National Education Policy 2020, the 3, principles are, number 1 is interdisciplinarity. For a very long time in Bombay University, if you're doing economics, you're not allowed to take maths courses. It's a fact. It's changed now, I think. So interdisciplinarity. Second is flexibility. So in and out, academic banking of credits, you can take a time off, and there's no stigma about taking a year off. It's been happening slowly. And third is experiential learning. Actually, learning by doing is, I'm a better economist, I hope, because after graduation, after my PhD, I think I became a better economist just by doing more. And economist is a guy who just works in the classroom. Imagine bankers, imagine engineers, imagine chip designers, imagine data scientists. They actually become better at their job because by doing, so learning by doing is a very big part of what, people become very good central bankers. Ajit Patel or whoever became a good central banker, Shaktikanta Das, very good example. My conviction is that learning by doing is a very big part of becoming a better at your job. Haven't, sorry, I'm going to take one more minute. One example which I'm personally familiar with. So we produce PhDs, but I found such resistance from the older faculty. I said, let the PhD students teach classes. What are you saying? How can we allow these people to teach? Arey Baba, then when are they going to teach? You're going to produce a PhD and just throw him or her into the water, and then he's going to start teaching the guinea pigs. So you can become a better teacher because you got to allow them to start teaching. So this is just a very trivial example. So I think these are the things that our education system needs to squarely face. That can we be more proactive about curriculum? Can we be more proactive about engagement with stakeholders and taking feedback, hearing our people who are our, I mean, who are the consumers, quote unquote, of the product? And can we look at the future, not just be ready with today's needs, but tomorrow's needs?
Thank you for such an excellent forward-looking mandate for all of us. Based on that, sorry. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So just a perspective, I think, in terms of capital and education of capital, is that at least in the India context, an expectation that transformation or from an education standpoint is going to happen via public funding itself is probably a misnomer, right? And I'm not saying this is all about public funding, even private universities are there. The solve has to be kind of different, especially given the Indian context, of how do you solve for people actually coming out and not being able to read and write at their level, which actually is the same problem in Western countries too. US has probably even bigger problem where somebody is kind of getting out of the 6th grade and can't do 2nd grade English or math. But that's probably because schools have actually become more of a thing to get to. It's a degree that you have rather than anything that you learn from a perspective anyhow. And from a private standpoint, so how does private funding or private institution kind of transform that? How does curriculum change very early on, right? And from an Indian context, you start looking at then the opportunity or the responsibility is a whole lot broader than just in metro cities or in semi-urban areas. You're talking about huge parts of India. India does not have enough schools for the people that we have. So if you start looking at it from that perspective, you have to start thinking, how do you get schools closer to them? How do you get better schools to them? So I'm almost answering the question of the other extreme of the problem. There is a problem the urban side too. There's no question about it. But I think, especially when you're talking about high-end skills, so you can be an engineer, but are you an AI engineer? Have you learned things and have you learned the basics of it? So how many people can understand neural network in the pure sense of it? How many people are statisticians who understand the theory of it? Are they taught that? Cross-functional learning, absolute cross-disciplinary learning, you have to understand the context of things. I agree with all of that. But I want to kind of switch it back and saying if this problem has to be solved, where the private money probably needs to go, let's talk about early education. Let's talk about early education way back into rural areas and saying what incentive structures do you create to get companies or entrepreneurs to actually go to those geographies, right? And I just want to kind of give maybe a perspective or a story from that individual. So for example, when we're trying to solve an education problem, we should not forget the challenges that are faced by any household in India, that could be urban or rural, that has a desire to make sure that the kids actually get higher education, but they don't have access to good schools. That's about an hour away, and you can't do any of those things, right? And their problem is they're looking for it. Here's an entrepreneur probably does incredible amount of work, how to get fascinating and new curriculum, experiential learning into schools across different parts of India. They want to do it. Their bigger problem is they cannot do it because they don't have capital for it. There's an issue in terms of where the capital comes in. Or saying, okay, how do I raise capital? Then who will invest in me? And the reason nobody invests in them is saying, well, this is good, it's all nice, but you're never going to give me any return because you're only going to be, the only thing you are actually solving for is very small number. You're not going to make too much in terms of revenue. Development sector schools are full of challenges where they can't make revenue. And that circularity of problem kind of continues, right? And that's a cycle that has to be broken. Because until we can figure out how you make sure that it is meaningful for an entrepreneur to start a school in any part of India that is economically feasible, I think we won't solve the problem. As much as education should change, I think it's unfair to expect a teacher who gets paid 10,000 rupees to transform the minds of children in any part of India. I'm talking about municipal schools in Bombay, that's how much teachers get paid. So, and we cannot magically say the teacher should get paid 20,000. The only way that you figure out is there is a capital, the capital framework is broken. You have to figure out how to make sure that there's an incentive to do it. And there are ways and means to do it. I think it comes to actually how do you enable these companies to be able to be profitable without charging a whole lot in terms of fees, and there are economic models that are there in different countries, even here, that we have to solve for. Because otherwise changing curriculum by itself or just expecting a change happening because of a public good, being put in a lot of public money for schools, I think we'll end up having a bigger problem, not still solving the problem that a 5-year-old or 10-year-old, 15-year-old coming out is trained well enough, or you don't have a master's in English learning it in Hindi issue. Right? We don't, the only way we survive that stuff is to actually create some innovation in the public schooling space or the schooling space. That only happens if entrepreneurs want to get in there. That only happens if they can promise a certain return, therefore they can get capital. It's connected. I'm not solving for the problem, but I'm trying to kind of submit maybe a different way to look at this stuff if we want to look at the future of that divide. That is definitely going to hit us and hit a lot of different countries, but it's about us being prepared for it. So.
Dr. Madhur.
A couple of thoughts, and since we're on, I think I switched myself. There we go. Since we're on education systems, let's begin with that. Agree with everything that's been said, but I think the bigger challenge for education systems is to move from upfront learning to lifelong learning. As the pace of technology changes and as how we do things change, I suspect you might be the last generation that actually has a 4, 8, 10-year education and then kind of goes through life more or less with here and there refresher courses. I think we might be looking at a completely different education system for your children. Also, I think a lot more on, you call it experiential learning. The other dimension to it is a lot more firm-based training and firms that actually train their own workforce, which some European countries have done for a good long time. It's said to be integral to the German model. But I think that's where this is going. And it's not just a question of, one department changing its curriculum initially. One other thought on, you asked a question, Aditi, on the relationship between labor and capital.
Yes.
I don't know yes, there's that. But I think the elephant in the room here is the dominance of intellectual property as a store of wealth. And so when multinationals come and you're saying they create high-paying jobs, that's not where the action is. It may be great for those folks that they're making 3 times the national average, but it's the intellectual property that they're creating which goes to head office, which is where the real money is. And so unless you find ways of creating intellectual property yourself, serf labor is always the next best. However well paid it is and however shiny the firm hiring you is, it's next best to having your own Google and your own Alphabet and so on to do these things. But some of the numbers that are now coming out, the S&P 500 index 30 years ago, something like 90% of its value was tangible assets and 10% was intangible assets. Today it's the complete reverse. 90% of the assets of the S&P 500 firms are intangible assets, most of which could be classified as some form of IP. IP is where the action is. And this is the new capitalism in some ways.
That's very interesting take on all of it. So we've heard views on higher education, grassroots level education, and then a completely different take on the IP of IP being the new capitalism. So I'd like to ask Mr. Vyas as the next question, because we are on this issue of labor, especially in the Indian economy. We've seen public policies being announced, including in the recent budget, regarding how SMEs should be the drivers and absorbers, rather, of labor. What would your views be regarding this? Because we have a thriving SME sector is what we always are told or hear about. But then when it comes to precisely all the points that have been made so far, and you spoke about the MNCs as well hiring, the MNCs versus SMEs, that's a whole class apart. And that would be, it would be interesting to hear your views on that, since you mentioned the MNCs as well, as to how these SMEs are going to factor in.
So, I think SMEs are assigned a kind of protection time and again in many ways. So right from the COVID times, we have seen that they're given loans with no collateral required. And you're causing a problem where none existed. So once you do that, there is no exiting from that. It's been documented by many economists. The Economic Survey said it some years ago, and I strongly subscribe to the view that the SMEs are a problem. They are inefficient users of capital, and they are inefficient users of labor. If we continue to have policies which will protect SMEs and essentially motivate them to remain SMEs, then you are causing a problem where none need exist. It's critically important that we have a thriving SME sector that becomes big or dies on its way to becoming big. So, firms dying is normal. New firms will be born. This happens mostly at the SME sector. But leaving SMEs at SME level by protecting them in multiple ways is, I think, an extremely bad idea. There were some automatic ways by which, not necessarily the best ways by which many SMEs got eliminated. Demonetization did that. But GST made many of them unviable because they couldn't pay the taxes and still survive. So still, if we go around trying to support them to keep them small, I think we are causing a huge disservice to ourselves. Large firms is what we need to be motivating to become even larger. Firms need to become large to give good quality employment. Getting a job, no one in this great institute, IIT Bombay, wants to go and work as a worker in an SME. You get the worst wages over there. They'd all like to work for a large company, and a large company, they may want to set up a small enterprise, but I'm sure they wouldn't like to remain small for their life. They'd like to grow. So it's important that the SMEs grow, and you require to unshackle them in a way by not giving them the protection that we're giving them right now. So that's my view on the SMEs. I'd also like to add to, this innovation thing. If a large part of the market is left to the SMEs, mind you, it creates a disincentive to the larger companies. After COVID, we have seen firms really bloom. And these are the listed companies. They have, as if they have got some great, boon from the COVID, that their profits, just look at the listed companies, their profits after COVID are 3.5x, 3.5 times, not percent, of what it was in the 10 years preceding. And in the 10 years preceding, it was flat. It wasn't that it was growing. So in 10 years preceding the COVID, listed companies' profits was flat. They went up and down, but they wavered around ₹1 trillion per quarter. And now, they are stabilizing at 3.5 trillion rupees a quarter. Now, a large part of this has happened because they took over the dying small-scale companies. And thereby, those small-scale companies that got merged into these larger companies became more efficient users of capital and labor. They could survive better. The labor in those firms are better off today than they were before they got taken over by these companies. So when these large companies, and this is also the reason why investments are not happening, but innovation will happen if companies become very large. And if you stop supporting the SMEs, it is critically important for us to recognize this fact and make space for the large firms to innovate. Innovation will happen from there. And that's where the capital will come. They will invest a lot. Currently, they're actually not investing into new net fixed assets because they're merely going and taking over those companies. So a large part of their growth is take their market, take their assets. You don't have to create new assets, and therefore new employment is not happening. But if you can recognize this and nurture it correctly, nudge it correctly, I think this is the way forward. But supporting SME, I think, is not a good idea. But if I've touched a raw nerve, I'm happy to deal with it.
very interesting take on it, because otherwise we've always heard, oh, SMEs should be generating employment, and that's the view usually. So that's a very interesting view. Based on the back of that conversation, there's a very interesting question that Professor Shaw also came up with, and that's why I'd like to ask that. In terms of, in today's world, what seems to have happened, and you spoke about this, Dr. Madura, right at the start with respect to the low marginal costs of things like music, digital entertainment. Marketability of skills seems to have become an important aspect. And this is because we have so many young scholars here who are also evidently entering the job market very soon, if not already. It seems to have become a crucial aspect of employability owing to this massive presence of social media platforms, which now have started acting as platforms for each of these individuals to seem like entrepreneurs marketing themselves, marketing their skill set in a sense. So each individual seems to be then gatekeeping the skill set in the form of, or in the guise of being an entrepreneur for themselves. So therefore, what in your opinion seems to be the limit of entrepreneurship? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Madura.
Two thoughts. One, since saying this in the temple of technology should get me, disinvited from dinner. But the first point I'd make is that in this new world and in this focus on technology and so on, the humanities should be even more important than they are now. Because what matters isn't a specific technical skill, but to be flexible, to know how to think, to be resilient, to adapt. And those are to understand each other. Those are exactly the things the humanities teach, not STEM, and not even often the social sciences. And so my first point is that in this new world, we will still see education systems that have this mix, and governments that think adapting to the new world means throwing more money at STEM are probably getting it wrong. The other point I'd make, which I think addresses your question more directly, is yes, COVID has shown us that we can work from home, that we can sort of atomize, and that's true, and that's technology enabled. It is also the case, as you said in your question, that social platforms make entrepreneurs of us all. In that sense, we might be moving to an even more globalized world of labor, which is not a bad thing, because where I thought globalization went wrong was we globalized capital flows without globalizing labor. If we write that, then that's a good. There's a whole bunch of not trivial operational issues here to do with taxation, which have to be sorted out. But let's say that's an institutional thing. But otherwise, that's a good thing. You asked what's the limit. I think the limit has to do with, again, back to my humanities point, the benefits of human interaction. Innovation, innovation, not everyone is the fellow who sat in his garage and invented the steam engine, Most innovation is group work. Most innovation has to do with human activity, gossiping around the water cooler and all of that. And I think if there's one thing COVID taught us, it was we can work from home, but I think COVID also taught us we can't just only work from home. And so the limits to all of this we're going to see have to do with not so much how much technology enables us to work away from home, but how much technology allows us to work with each other. So now I gather that there's a next generation of technology with avatars and so on where you can actually be with each other. I'm not smart enough to visualize whether that replaces this, but the limit will be the benefits of group interaction and the benefits of agglomeration.
Dr. Ranade, sorry.
Your question was, what is the limit of entrepreneurship? You know what I observe? The limit of unemployment is entrepreneurship. So ultimately, a guy gives up being unemployed and says, okay, I'm self-employed. That is a pity. Now,
It's a very interesting take. Professor Ranade, I wanted to change that one aspect, or rather frame the question based on one of the aspects which Dr. Madhura mentioned, which is, yes, we all started working from home. And to combine what Dr. Madhura said, as well as Mr. Vyas mentioned, with respect to saying that, with respect to the employability aspect and huge MNCs employing some of these people to work from home, which also led to people being employed across borders, but at the same time being paid in respective currencies. So that brings me to this aspect of the monetary systems evolving in terms of, and you mentioned taxation because that's also going to be an issue then, wherein how do you think these monetary systems are now going to evolve in the face of all of these changes, the global volatility, AI coming into the picture, people working remotely, and where do you think the dollar hegemony fits in this entire conversation as a result?
Yeah, this is the interaction of, this is the payments now. Is it dollar? Is it crypto? Is it central bank digital currency? So I think the dollar hegemony is going to be around for a while because we don't have an alternate candidate. The crypto guys, you know, there was a lot of hope riding on it, and it's still not clear to me it's going to be a significant force. I mean, it looks like crypto is more an investment vehicle rather than a payment mechanism. So there are these celebrated examples of, BCG is accepting crypto payments. So this one-off, you know, big news item. But for most part, crypto is still an investment thing. And CBDC also has not yet become, in India at least, and wherever it's been tried, there are problems with CBDC. So we are left with old-fashioned currencies, and the interesting thing about the dollar is, as I said earlier, that if you look at American share of global trade, it's only about 10%. American share of global GDP is 25%. American share of SWIFT payments is about 40-50%. American share of global exchange reserves, it's a reserve currency, is about 60 or 65%. It's come down 5%. It used to be 70%. And American share of invoicing is 90%. So there's simply no candidate available. There's no yuan, no euro, certainly not the euro. Who's there? I mean, American dollar share American dollar share of global invoicing is 90%. So a Saudi sheikh buying a Japanese Toyota, the Japanese currency is yen, Saudi is dinar, but they're still invoicing in dollars.
No, I get that. You were saying American and
dollar. It's not the Canadian dollar, it's the American dollar. I mean, the dollar hegemony, so that's the thing about Mr. Trump, that on one hand, he is desperate that the American currency becomes weaker because it means more exports and more jobs. But at the same time, he's threatening BRICS people that God help you if you try to do non-dollar invoicing, non-dollar trade. So on one hand, you want the dollar to be strong and stable and accepted worldwide. And on the other hand, you want the dollar to be weaker, and you can't have it both ways, right? But, you know, this is a different economics, not 101, but maybe minus 101 or something. So I think for whichever way, and let me just add one more minute. Why is this happening? Because the whole world believes in the dollar. The Chinese $3 or $4 trillion of their pile of foreign exchange is largely invested in the American dollar. Indians saw exchange rate, it was about 750 billion, now it's around to 650. Again, largely in dollars. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, everybody is invested in the dollar. And the moment there's investor panic, nervousness, anxiety, the flows are again uphill. Capital flows uphill to New York. And why is that? Because, well, the whole world implicitly believes in the American financial and judicial system. It's a system. This is, you know, This is voting with your feet. I mean, I don't know what to call it. Voting with your feet. Actions speak louder than words. And until that is the reality, we have to live with the dollar hegemony.
Thank you so much. I would like, if any of you have any last 1 minute thoughts, and before I throw it open to the audience, and we can, on the challenges.
I'll just tell you an anecdote from the recent BRICS summit in Kazan. And you know, all delegates get like this information package like we got for this conference on power outlets and this and that. And there was a section reminding delegates that they couldn't bring their regular credit cards because Russia has been expelled from SWIFT and they wouldn't work. And so please bring alternatives. And you know, the alternative was a credit card that works only in Russia. Of course, what the majority of delegates did was brought US dollars cash. That's your point about it.
Oh, by the way, the exorbitantly privileged, I forgot to mention, this dollar hegemony, on one hand, whatever, but there is a huge, the word they use, I think, I don't know who was the first one to use this word, exorbitant privilege. Whether it's seniorage income, you know, the estimates are 50 to $100 billion every year, silent tax collected by the United States government from non-voters, non-citizens. And then there is, so that is direct collection, but there's so many other, this huge privilege. The only country which needs to worry, it's highly indebted, but which can forgive its own debt, there's only one country in the world, which is US.
Last thoughts? Okay, thank you so much to all the panelists for such an engaging discussion that we've had. I'd now like to open it up for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Now I have 2 pointers for you to reflect upon. One is Dr. Ranade and Satish. We have had, looking around the world, we have had a peculiar situation in many developing countries till now, as against the developed countries. The quality primary education is extremely expensive, whereas the quality higher education is relatively very cheap. So while your point about revising the syllabus and making it suitable to industry, all that is well taken, but is it time for us to also have a reversal of it, especially in focusing on the primary education, if the government schools have really not delivered, as a report says, Mr. Vyas also talks about it. Is it time for us to go for a public-private partnership mode, primary schools?
I have a strong view on,
on that. So then I'll come back to another question.
I think the primary education is a public good and higher education, college education is not a public good. So that's the original fallacy, that if we agree, all of us agree that it's a public good, then whatever we do for public goods should apply to primary education. And if we agree that tertiary education, college education is not a public good, in the sense that the primary beneficiary of a good IIT degree is the person who is getting the degree, or his or her family. Society benefits in a very indirect way much later when they go to California and there's a brand and Sundar Pichai becomes the CEO, Indians are becoming CEO, so indirect brain drain. But unlike for a primary education, an educated child, 50% benefit to the child, but 50% to society at large. So if we accept that paradigm straight away, it follows that much more public resources should go into primary education.
Yeah, that's exactly what is not happening. We know where exactly we are lacking.
No, I agree 100% in terms of the multiplier effect is much, much more, and therefore investments have to be a lot more. And I'm not averse to anything, nor am I stating anything or taking a position in terms of saying it all has to be private money or not. I'm just looking at the economics of it in terms of where the money would come from and what the value would be. Subsidizing schools by definition might not work. I don't think it is a scalable thing. I don't think there are evidences of that necessarily happening, well, at least not in emerging economies is my guess. There has to be some model that has to be figured out, right? There is some math that has to work out. I would not recommend making everything private and let the market forces run it. I think we'll be dead, and there's probably a challenge anyhow. But there's a balance somewhere, right, around frameworks as well as some money coming in. And I think especially the second point I would make is not just the presence of education. Like I said, presence of education, availability of education is the responsibility of the state, no question about it, that has to be there. How do you enhance it? There's a role for private players in that, and that exists today. And there is an economics of that too, to how to actually figure out what the customer is, end customer is the student, but the schools come in. I think a lot that can be done. The point that I was making was, even though there exist in pockets, the ability to scale that at a largest level that can have benefits, that only happens if capital gets invested, right? So I do agree in the sense that the answer is not subsidies to small businesses to actually do it. How do you create incentive structure that they can? Well, there is creative destruction, so be it in those terms like companies, but it actually comes down to everything, our risk capital, right? What is our desire as a society to take risks with companies we're talking about the education sector, to be able to come in from an enhancement standpoint, maybe fail, but then new ones come in and there is an economic benefit to be able to do it. That's what we have to solve for. It's doable, obviously, mathematically, but there are a lot of risks that needs to be taken. So.
Thank you. Can I just follow up with one question to Mr. Vyas? On the MSME, okay. No, based on the data that you provide to us, I'm sure you are aware that the members of FICCI and ASSOCHAM are net importers to the economy, whereas MSME sector are net exporters, foreign exchange earners to the economy. Should we really say that MSME should not be encouraged?
There can
for
be,
India, in Indian context.
Sure. I mean, you pointed out one data point, that FICCI members are net importers and the others are net exporters. That could very well, of course, be right. But there can be other similar data points to prove the other side of the point as well. So, unless we look at the whole thing, simple point is that our big successes, even in terms of exports, you look at the IT companies, you will not find MSME companies becoming an IT exporter. So maybe the sample of FICCI and CII could be more of manufacturing. And in manufacturing, there are sectors which SMEs do export a lot more, small engineering goods and so on and so forth. But that doesn't make us an export giant. Our market share, whether it is garments or it is tea or it is whichever else, is largely falling. And we have lost markets in leather and many other places which were largely in the small scale sector, whereas we are winning in the ones where we have large companies like IT. So I still beg to differ, sir.
This is a question for Dr. Ranade. And the question you have asked about the NEP is about and you have referred to the point of interdisciplinary discipline. I just want to know what is the definition, because if you look at economics, I think it is one of the most interdisciplinary discipline we have. We have gone out of our comfort area, we have gone into psychology, we have gone into political science, we have gone into sociology, and we have our economic way of thinking. And we have gone to management also. So when you are speaking of interdisciplinary, how do you define it? One. And secondly, you are also propagating way of the freedom of choice among the student to take courses. But what is the employability of a student who have really spread too thin across multiple disciplines, but at the end of the graduation, you are not good in any of the discipline, and what is the employability of that person? So that is a question I always have when we think of these two things.
So this doesn't have a binary 0 or 1 answer. The fact is that it is progressively going in the direction of interdisciplinarity. For example, behavioral economics, it didn't exist maybe 20 years ago. It's progressively going in that direction. But I told you, as recently I found out that in Bombay University, you are not allowed to take maths courses. It's a fact. So but when I say interdisciplinarity, I mean that you are pursuing a degree in economics, so there's 132 credits, right? Or whatever, 4 years, 140 or whatever, 200 credits. So you should define a core requirement. If it's all credit based, then maybe 100 credits are required. But you have some room to play around with the remaining 100 credits. You can take music, you can take Greek history if you want to. So, or you can take, as you said, psychology. You can do a minor. These concepts are new, by the way. They didn't exist I don't know. The fact that you can do a major in economics and a minor in computer science, or a minor in something else, history, political science. As an economist, I'm very happy too that you are saying that we have always been open-minded about it. But sometimes I feel economists say, hey, you guys are all welcome. Demography, social science, and political science, you're all welcome. But we are the king. You have to be equal to me. We are to, anyway, that's one conversation. The other thing is you're saying employability. So that is what we were talking about, right? If you agree, if all of us agree that our basic job is to create employable products, it's not just liberal, great thought, simple living, Greek culture and whatever, Indic, Chanakya, but we want to finally have graduates who are employable by the industry, then we've had to go and talk to our stakeholders. We should talk to the banking and financial services industry. Hey, what do you guys want? Are our people, can they hit the ground running? Or many people in the financial services industry, they find they have to train them for another 3 months or 6 months, the polishing part, or L&T things, or data science, or IBM, so why can't we incorporate what they want, the finishing part? So that's the stakeholder discussion. So and you are afraid that if you give too much choice to the students, they will just be too diluted. And so that's where with this concept of core requirement, you have 200 credits you do in 4 years, or whatever, 150, 160 credits. You define what a core degree will you have to take Calculus 1 and Calculus 2. So there are core requirements, and then there is the remaining part. So I think it can be worked on. It's not a 0-1 thing.
One more question to Mr. Vyas. What is the difference between self-employment and entrepreneur? Because the way you said the limit of entrepreneur is unemployment. What is the difference between these two?
I said semi-tongue-in-cheek that the limit of unemployment is entrepreneurship. That you remain unemployed for a long time, and then you cannot afford to remain unemployed anymore, and you are from urban India, then you become a real estate agent, and you call yourself self-employed entrepreneur. So that's what is happening in many places. If you're in rural India, then you will do something similar. You will push a cart somewhere, become something similar. So the definition are similar. Entrepreneurs are of various kinds. One kind is the self-entrepreneur. He or she employs nobody more than himself. So we have seen this in the data from 2016 till now. I look at the number of entrepreneurs and I look at the number of salaried employees. And the number of entrepreneurs has really zoomed up and the number of salaried employees has declined. So these entrepreneurs are not creating more jobs, they are only keeping something like a job as a fig leaf for themselves.
Swiggy, Zomato, gig labor.
It's worse than that. Swiggy, Zomato is still a job, you take some money home. If I'm a real estate agent, I'm actually nothing. So
I mean, just to add, I think most people, if you take a survey, my guess is 60 to 70% people would like a job, or maybe 80%. If you take what's your choice, first choice, do you want to be an entrepreneur or do you want a job, secure job, well-paying, productive job? I think a very large percentage of people just basic first preference is to get a job. So as you say,
So we ran a survey and we asked people, we asked two questions. What kind of a job would you like? But what is more potent is what kind of a job would you like for your child? Okay, so that is more potent. And even for the second one, the predominant answer was a government job. And mind you, Ajit, the next came entrepreneur. And then came a private job. So the private job is not really preferred. It is actually, because predominantly those jobs are SME, sir.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for such an engaging discussion. I now request our head of the department to felicitate our panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Doctor, thank you. Thank you. Distinguished alumni of IITB. And the advisor to the department. Thank you so much. You are giving us the data for Thank you. Thank you so much. Please join us for coffee outside. I am successful. Are you staying for this? This only coffee.